It was on a September morning in the year 1982 that the air along the steep and curling roads above Monaco grew heavy with silence. A car had left the path, tumbling into the dry brush of the mountainside, and within its twisted frame lay Grace, Princess of Monaco, once a queen of Hollywood light. The accident was sudden, yet the echoes it left behind seemed endless, for in that hour, a woman who had been shaped by many worlds was carried from them all, leaving only questions, whispers, and memories scattered like petals in the wind. Before we wander into the path of her life, dear listener, I invite you to pause and share with us where and when you are listening. Are you by a quiet window in the evening, or resting on a journey, or perhaps drifting into sleep? This tale, like all tales, belongs to a circle wider than one alone, and each memory becomes richer when bound together. If you wish to join us again on other evenings, I invite you gently to press the subscribe button so that this circle may remain unbroken. Now let us step backward through the corridors of time, away from the final road of her life, and into the bright, restless days of her beginning. The morning light of Philadelphia in the year 1929 fell across a house that was both strict and splendid. In that year, as the world trembled with economic collapse, the Kelly family held firm in their fortress of wealth. John B. Kelly, father to the newborn Grace, had built his fortune in brick and mortar, his strong hands having once rowed with Olympic force across waters that mirrored the sky. He was a man of power and ambition, a self-made millionaire who had risen from humble beginnings to stand among the city's pillars of influence. Beside him, his wife Margaret, elegant and resolute, carried with her the heritage of German roots and the discipline of her Catholic faith. Into this household came Grace Patricia Kelly, their third daughter, born on November 12th. Her cry mingling with the voices of siblings and the stern rhythms of a house where achievement was a daily demand. The air was filled with expectation, for the Kelly children were not raised merely to exist, but to excel, to embody the proof that hard work and dignity could carve a dynasty even in the new world. Yet within that expectation, one can imagine a child's quiet longing for softness, for permission simply to dream. Grace's childhood home was stately, and within it lingered both warmth and severity. The scent of polished wood mingled with the incense of the nearby church, and every Sunday was marked by ritual and solemnity. At meals, the family gathered in order, the conversations carried by voices certain of their views, and though laughter would arise, it was not without the undercurrent of discipline. The father's presence was commanding, his gaze expectant, and though Grace adored him, she was also quietly daunted by the weight of his pride. As a girl, Grace was not the robust child her family might have hoped for. She was slender, delicate in build, prone to daydreaming, and often lost in her own imaginings. In a household that praised athletic vigor and assertive confidence, she appeared at times as a softer shadow, withdrawn into her books or her dolls. Her sisters were praised for their strength, her brother for his energy, yet Grace lingered in the margins, watching, listening, quietly weaving her own inner world. In this, perhaps, the seeds of her later elegance were planted, for she learned early that silence could hold more power than noise. There is a story told of how young Grace would retreat to her room and arrange her dolls in elaborate scenes, directing them like characters upon a private stage. She would whisper their lines, shifting her voice to capture their imagined emotions, and even as her family considered this a harmless pastime, she was rehearsing for the great theater of life that awaited her. One might wonder whether she already felt that her own voice could only be heard through invention, through the safety of play. At school, she carried herself with modesty, though her striking looks were already noted. Teachers described her as polite, reserved, almost distant, though when asked to read aloud, her voice carried a clarity that surprised those around her. There was a gentle authority in her diction, as though each word was chosen with care, and this quality would one day become her signature on screen. Yet even in those early days, Grace was aware that she was seen as different, less confident than her siblings, more aloof than her peers. Her Catholic upbringing weighed upon her, for the rituals of faith were strict, and the gaze of the community was ever watchful. The church bells that tolled across Philadelphia each week were reminders of both belonging and constraint. And for a girl inclined to dream of worlds beyond, the walls of religion could feel confining. Still, she absorbed its symbols deeply. The flicker of candlelight, the sound of choral hymns, the scent of incense, all these would stay with her, part of the sensory palette that colored her life and the roles she chose. By the age of 10, Grace was already forming a distinct identity. Where others sought the approval of her father by excelling in sports, she sought refuge in imagination. She spent hours reading poetry, tracing lines of Keats and Wordsworth, memorizing stanzas that spoke of longing and fleeting beauty. When she read aloud, her voice became hushed and rhythmic, carrying the listener into realms far removed from the rigid lines of her family's expectations. Yet, in that same household, the pressure to achieve was never absent. Grace's father, who valued victory in sport and business, struggled to understand his daughter's introspective nature. He referred to her as his awkward child, not in malice, but in disappointment, unable to see that her strength lay not in physical triumphs, but in subtler expressions. For a sensitive child, such words could not help but linger, and they may have been the first shadows of the lifelong conflict she carried, the desire to please, yet the need to remain true to her own temperament. In summer, the Kelly family retreated to the Jersey shore, where the sea air carried scents of salt and kelp, and where the waves offered both play and contemplation. Grace would walk the sand in silence, her hands clasped behind her back, gazing at the horizon. Her siblings would run and shout, their bodies agile and assured, while she drifted at the edges, contemplative, almost spectral. It is easy to imagine that in those moments the child Grace sensed another life awaiting her, though she could not yet name its shape. As adolescence approached, the quiet girl began to grow into her features. Her eyes, pale and thoughtful, seemed to belong to an older soul. Her hair, soft and golden, caught the light in ways that drew notice. She was not yet considered a beauty, but there was a refinement in her bearing that hinted at something unusual. She walked with poise, her gestures graceful, as though she were already preparing for stages she had not yet seen. Still, within the house on Henry Avenue, she remained the daughter who did not quite fit the mold. The family valued visibility in society, athletic success, and assertiveness, while Grace drifted towards solitude and art. The tension of that difference would stay with her for decades, for even in her later roles as actress and princess, she would often be cast as the cool observer, the figure both inside and outside her world. One wonders, did she already sense, as a young girl, that her path would lead her away from the patterns set before her? Did the silence she cultivated as a child prepare her for the scrutiny of millions? Or was it instead a shield she never quite put down? As twilight gathered over the Kelly home, lamps flickered against the walls, and the day's demands faded into whispers of prayer. The young Grace would retreat once more to her room, her dolls waiting, her books spread open, the window showing her the faint glow of the city beyond. There, in the quiet hum of distant traffic and the shadows of passing clouds, her imagination opened like a secret doorway, and through it she stepped into a world that was her own. And it is here, in this childhood cocoon of privilege, pressure, and private dreams, that the figure of Grace Kelly first began to take shape. Not yet the star, not yet the princess, but already a soul apart, suspended between expectation and longing, like a candle flame wavering in a draught. The sound of that candle's flicker remains unresolved, and it is through this fragile light that we move onward into the restless years of her youth, where dreams of theater began to whisper louder than the voices of her family, of her. The flicker of the candle that marked her childhood seemed to cast its glow further as she stepped beyond the rooms of her family home. The silence of her private imaginings, once confined to dolls and books, began to press outward, seeking a stage, a space where her inner world could take form. Grace had reached the age where youthful reverie must either fade into the duties of adulthood or sharpen into ambition. And though her family saw her as delicate, even aloof, she carried within her a steadfastness that was not easily dismissed. The streets of Philadelphia echoed with industry and tradition, yet Grace's eyes were fixed elsewhere. She spoke often of theater, of words made flesh upon the stage, and though her family was skeptical, her mother, perhaps sensing something unspoken in her daughter, allowed her to pursue the thought. Acting was not the profession of respectability in those years. To stand beneath stage lights was considered precarious, even improper for a young woman of their standing. Yet Grace was determined, and in that determination she revealed a quiet rebellion. She chose to follow a path that her father could not easily admire, one that would never win medals or trophies, but which promised another kind of immortality. At first, she turned to local theater groups, shyly stepping into minor parts. Her voice, clear and deliberate, began to set her apart, though critics of her youth declared it too measured, too distant. Grace was told she lacked warmth, that her diction was stiff, as though she were reciting rather than feeling. Such words might have discouraged another, but for Grace they seemed to strengthen her resolve. She did not argue. She did not fight. She simply continued, polishing her speech, refining her presence, carrying within her the belief that restraint could itself be a form of expression. When she left Philadelphia for New York City, the rhythm of her life changed as though she had crossed an invisible threshold. The city was a humming orchestra of traffic, voices, and ambition. Skyscrapers loomed like monuments to restless energy, and Grace, slender and poised, appeared almost spectral among the throngs. She entered the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, a place where dreams of stage and screen intertwined, and there she set about her training with characteristic discipline. The Academy demanded not only talent but endurance. Students were drilled in voice projection, movement, and the art of inhabiting a character. Grace's voice, once a point of critique, became her focus. She labored over her delivery, smoothing the edges of her Philadelphia accent until her words carried a polished neutrality. She practiced in front of mirrors, correcting the set of her jaw, the curve of her hands, the posture of her spine. She understood, even then, that acting was not merely the portrayal of emotion, but the craft of presenting oneself as something more than human, as a symbol, a figure through which audiences could glimpse fragments of their own longing. And yet the struggle was constant. Teachers noted her elegance but questioned her warmth. Fellow students admired her beauty but wondered if she could embody passion. Grace bore such doubts with a calm exterior, though privately she must have felt the sting of being forever regarded as distant. In her letters home, she spoke of progress, of performances and roles, but beneath her words, one may sense the loneliness of a young woman striving in a city vast and indifferent. To sustain herself, Grace turned to modeling, her image gracing magazines and advertisements. There she found quick success, for her face, with its delicate symmetry and translucent skin, seemed to embody a timeless ideal. Yet she regarded this work not as triumph, but as necessity. Modeling was bread, acting was fire. Each photograph taken of her was another reminder that the world valued her beauty, yet she longed for recognition of her craft. Did she fear, even then, that her face might overshadow her voice? In those years, Grace lived in a modest apartment, the hum of the city her constant companion. The air smelled of ink and dust, the stairwells echoed with the footsteps of strangers, and the nights were often cold. She cooked little, walked much, and carried herself with the quiet dignity that had always marked her. Neighbors spoke of her politeness, her reserve, the way she seemed both near and far at once. If they invited her to gatherings, she would smile, attend briefly, then withdraw, preferring the solitude of her books and rehearsals. Her determination bore fruit when she began to secure small roles in live television productions, a medium still in its early bloom. These performances demanded precision, for mistakes were broadcast without correction, and Grace's disciplined nature suited the challenge. On screen, she appeared ethereal, her movements restrained yet magnetic, her voice carrying with it the calm clarity she had cultivated. Producers noted her ability to hold attention without force, as though her very stillness compelled the eye to linger. And yet, even as doors opened, doubts remained. Some saw in her only a model who could speak lines. Others regarded her as too aristocratic for common roles. This paradox clung to her, shaping the kinds of characters she was offered. Women of refinement, women set apart. Grace was already being cast into the mold of elegance, a mold that both elevated and confined her. One may pause here to reflect on how early in life these patterns form. Was Grace choosing her roles, or were her roles choosing her? Did she believe, in those days of small parts and relentless practice, that she would one day be regarded not merely as actress, but as symbol? Or was she simply walking forward, step by step, her candle of childhood imagination guiding her into rooms she had not yet dared to dream? It is said that when she visited home during these years, her family remained uncertain of her path. Her father still questioned the worth of her profession, comparing it unfavorably with the solidity of business or sport. Her mother supported her with quiet dignity, though without the exuberance that might have eased her daughter's doubts. Among her siblings there was affection, but also a sense that Grace was different, her gaze set upon horizons they could not fully share. In these family encounters, Grace must have felt both loved and misunderstood, a tension that would follow her through every stage of her life. Yet in New York, she found mentors who recognized her discipline. One director, impressed by her ability to remain utterly composed under the glare of cameras, remarked that she possessed a quality rare among young actresses. She did not chase attention, she drew it by doing less. This paradox, the power of restraint, would become her signature, though it would also feed the criticism that she was distant, even cold. As the years passed, Grace began to feel the pull of cinema. Film, with its power to magnify every detail, seemed suited to her subtlety. Where stage demanded grand gestures, film rewarded nuance, the flicker of an eyelash, the tension of a paused breath. She sensed that her craft might find fuller expression before the camera's unblinking eye. Yet entering that world required more than talent. It demanded chance, timing, and the willingness to surrender to an industry that often valued image over soul. And so, Grace stood at the threshold, poised between obscurity and recognition, between the modest life of a working actress and the uncertain promise of cinematic immortality. Her candle still flickered, its flame steadier now, illuminating not only the quiet corridors of imagination, but the bustling avenues of New York, where destiny itself seemed to wait at the corner of every street. The sound of those streets, horns, voices, the rattle of trains, faded into the whisper of a camera shutter, a transition from one world to another. It is with that whisper that we move forward, into the realm where photographs turned into moving images, and where Grace Kelly first stepped into the light of cinema. The whisper of the camera shutter, soft yet insistent, lingered in her mind like the ticking of an unseen clock. It was in that sound that Grace Kelly began to sense how image could eclipse substance, how the eye of the world might rest upon her face even before it sought to know her voice. For though she longed for the stage, it was the camera that first embraced her, capturing not her words, but her silence, the curve of her cheek, the distant clarity of her gaze. Modeling had come to her as necessity, a way to sustain herself in the restless city, yet soon it began to shape the outlines of her destiny. Magazine covers bore her image, advertisements displayed her as the symbol of an ideal, cool, elegant, almost untouchable. The public did not yet know her name, but they knew her face. And faces, in that age of expanding media, traveled faster than stories. To Grace, it was both opportunity and burden, for she wanted to be more than a surface, yet the world seemed content to hold her in still frames. In the quiet moments of her small apartment, she would sometimes glance at those glossy pages, at the girl who stared back with unblinking poise. Did she recognize herself in that reflection? Or did she feel it was another mask, another layer that obscured the self she guarded? The still image, like a mirror, gave no answers. It offered beauty, yet beauty was not the whole of her. Perhaps in those hours she whispered lines of poetry to herself, reminding her heart that words had weight, that behind the photographs lingered a soul shaped by longing. The modeling assignments were not without glamour. She wore fine clothes, walked through studios where lights shone like miniature suns, and met photographers whose eyes searched for perfection in every detail. Yet, amid the bustle, she remained distant, professional, never seeking the flirtations or gossip that might ensnare others. Her reserve became part of her mystique. Some colleagues found her aloof, others found her gracious, but none could quite pierce the veil she carried. Grace moved as though she belonged to another rhythm, slower, more deliberate, a rhythm that did not always fit the pulse of the industry around her. And yet, for all her detachment, she was learning. Each click of the shutter taught her how to hold stillness, how to let the smallest shift of expression convey meaning. She learned how the play of light across her features could change a mood, how posture could suggest either invitation or distance. These lessons, though born of commerce, would serve her well when she crossed into cinema, for she was already training in the language of the lens. But there was an undercurrent of tension. Beauty, once celebrated, soon became confining. Grace began to sense that the world might never look past her elegance, that she would forever be cast as an image rather than a voice. Did she feel, in those years, the first hints of the cage that would later surround her in Monaco? For beauty, though treasured, can also be a form of imprisonment, locking the soul behind glass where it may be admired but never fully touched. She found refuge in her inner discipline. Even as she posed for photographers, she continued her studies at the academy, attending rehearsals, reciting lines, striving to prove that she was not merely an ornament. Teachers who once doubted her warmth began to notice the quiet intensity of her commitment. She did not seek to overwhelm the stage with grand gestures, but rather to inhabit a space with subtle control. When she read, audiences leaned in, straining to catch the delicacy of her expression. It was a style that did not command, but rather compelled. In time, her modeling and her training began to converge. Casting directors, leafing through magazines, saw in her a face that might suit the new medium of live television drama. These productions were unpolished, broadcast with minimal rehearsal, vulnerable to every mistake. Yet Grace excelled in them. Her calmness under pressure, her unshaken poise, made her a natural. The same qualities that rendered her distant in person became, on screen, the very traits that drew viewers to her. They sensed that she carried secrets, that beneath the smooth surface there were depths unspoken. And so, the line between image and performance began to blur. She was no longer only the girl on the magazine cover, nor merely the student in the academy's classrooms. She was becoming a presence, fragile yet luminous, that audiences could not easily dismiss. Still, the paradox remained. The very elegance that set her apart was also the barrier that kept her from the roles of passion she desired. Casting agents saw her as aristocrat, as society woman, as figure of refinement. Rarely did they imagine her as ordinary or fiery. Already the mold was forming around her, cool and perfect, like marble taking shape under the sculptor's hand. In private, perhaps she wondered if she was betraying her own dreams. The theater, with its rough edges and raw immediacy, had always called to her heart. Yet the camera, with its unyielding gaze, was the path that beckoned her forward. Was she choosing this fate, or was it choosing her? The line between ambition and inevitability blurred, as it so often does in the lives of those who become legends. Her family, watching from afar, remained divided. To her father, modeling was little more than frivolity, an endeavor unworthy of pride. To her mother, it was respectable enough, so long as Grace maintained her dignity. To Grace herself, it was both ladder and labyrinth, a means of ascent, but also a maze from which escape seemed uncertain. And so, in the stillness of her apartment at night, when the hum of the city dulled to a distant murmur, Grace would return to her books, to her poetry, to the small rituals of reflection that had always sustained her. The candle of her childhood was now joined by the electric glow of the city outside her window, yet she remained the same, quiet, deliberate, searching for meaning beyond appearances. The whisper of the shutter, once faint, had grown into a steady rhythm, guiding her towards cinema. The magazines and advertisements had made her face familiar, but it would be the moving image that revealed her power. In the stillness of a photograph, she was admired. In the motion of film, she would be unforgettable. It is with this shift, from stillness to motion, from surface to story, that we follow her into the world of her first true film roles, where directors would begin to see not only her beauty, but her strange, compelling presence. The shutter's whisper fades, replaced by the soft whir of the film reel, carrying us into the next stage of her journey. The soft whir of the film reel carried her from still images into the trembling world of moving light, where gestures breathed and silence itself could speak. Grace Kelly, once frozen in glossy photographs, now shimmered in motion, her poise no longer confined to the frame of a magazine, but unfolding across the flickering screen. It was in this fragile medium of early television and tentative film roles that she began to shape the presence that would soon captivate audiences around the world. Her first appearances were brief, often small parts in live television dramas that demanded precision under pressure. In those early broadcasts, every pause, every glance mattered, for there was no second chance. Mistakes lived on in the memory of viewers, uncorrected and unpolished. Yet Grace thrived in this environment, her calmness a shield, her quiet control a rare asset. Where others faltered under the heat of the studio lights, she remained composed, her voice steady, her movements deliberate. It was as though she had been preparing for this all her life, practicing in childhood bedrooms, perfecting her diction, refining her bearing. Those who watched her remarked on her ability to hold attention without strain. She did not rush. She did not overplay. Instead, she allowed the camera to come to her, to linger on the subtleties of her gaze, the gentleness of her movements. She seemed to understand instinctively that film was not the theater, that the smallest flicker of thought, the most delicate shift of expression, could be magnified until it filled the hearts of those watching. This restraint, once seen as aloofness, became her strength. In 1951, her quiet persistence brought her to her first true role in cinema, a small part in the film 14 Hours. She played the young woman engaged to a troubled man, her presence brief but luminous. Critics noted her elegance, her naturalness before the camera, though her part was modest. For Grace, however, it was a doorway. The reel that captured her face in that film would travel to eyes that mattered, eyes that searched for new stars. It is easy to imagine her, sitting in the darkened theater during the screening, watching herself flicker across the screen. Did she feel pride? Or did she feel the distance between what she longed to achieve and what she had yet accomplished? For an actress so attuned to nuance, seeing her own image magnified must have been both thrilling and unsettling. The camera revealed her beauty, yes, but also the restraint that had always defined her. Would audiences mistake that restraint for absence, or would they sense the depths beneath? After 14 hours, she continued to work in television, honing her craft. She appeared in anthology dramas, each week a new story, a new character, a new test of her adaptability. Here she learned not only to act, but to survive, for the pace was relentless, the pay modest, and the recognition fleeting. Yet she persevered, driven less by fame than by the quiet conviction that she belonged to the world of performance. Her life in New York during these years was disciplined and solitary. She rose early, studied scripts, rehearsed diligently, and carried herself with the composure of one who understood that opportunity could vanish at any moment. Friends described her as gracious but reserved, never reckless, never given to excess. She attended social gatherings, but rarely stayed late. She spoke with kindness, but revealed little of herself. Always, there was the sense of distance, as though she were both present and absent, a figure of beauty glimpsed through glass. The industry began to take notice. Her photographs circulated among casting directors, her performances whispered about in modest circles. And then, in 1952, her path widened. She was cast opposite Gary Cooper in High Noon, the Western that would become a classic. Grace played Amy Fowler Kane, the pacifist bride of the Marshal, a woman torn between principle and love. It was not a role of fire, but one of quiet tension, and it suited her perfectly. Standing beside Cooper, whose weathered face and measured voice carried the gravity of the American frontier, Grace appeared almost spectral, young, delicate, her pale features lit with the light of conviction. Her performance was understated, yet it carried a clarity that critics could not ignore. She was no longer merely a model who acted. She was an actress who could hold her own beside giants. High Noon brought her name into wider circles, though even then she was seen as a figure of refinement, not passion, as if the industry could only imagine her as the embodiment of elegance. The paradox deepened. On the one hand, she was recognized for her poise and beauty. On the other, she longed for roles that would challenge her, that would allow her to reveal the complexity she carried within. Did she ever wonder, as she left the sets of those early films, whether her destiny was already being decided for her? Was she shaping her career, or was the industry shaping her into the archetype of the cool, remote beauty? Her father, still skeptical, watched her rise with mixed feelings. To him, acting remained less substantial than sport or business, yet he could not deny the growing recognition of his daughter's name. The awkward child, the one who had seemed unsuited to the family's mold, was now stepping into a different kind of triumph. Perhaps pride mingled with his doubts, though Grace herself would never forget the distance she felt between his approval and her own sense of purpose. On the set of High Noon, she absorbed more than her lines. She observed the workings of the crew, the rhythm of production, the way a film came together piece by piece. She was a student of the craft as much as a performer, keenly aware that acting was not merely the delivery of words, but the weaving of self into a larger fabric. This attentiveness, this willingness to learn would serve her well as greater roles beckoned. After High Noon, offers began to arrive, though they were still modest, still cautious. Hollywood recognized her beauty, her elegance, but hesitated to grant her the roles of intensity she desired. Yet the tide was turning, and Grace sensed that her candle, once flickering in solitude, was now being carried into larger rooms. One can picture her, standing at the edge of the set after a day's work, the lights dimming, the air filled with the faint smell of dust and film stock. Around her, voices drifted, laughter echoed, and yet she stood slightly apart, reflective, poised. Did she already know that her path would carry her far beyond these rooms, into a realm where her name would be spoken with reverence? Or did she simply feel the quiet satisfaction of work well done, step by step, as she had always approached her craft? The reel spun on, carrying her image into more theaters, more hearts. From the modest beginnings of live television to the quiet strength of High Noon, she was moving toward a destiny she could not yet see. The sound of the reel faded into silence, and in that silence, another voice prepared to speak, the voice of a director who would recognize in Grace not only elegance but mystery, and who would cast her in roles that would forever define her. The silence that lingered after the reel ceased its turning seemed to wait for another presence, and into that waiting stepped a figure whose gaze had always been drawn to mystery. Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense, had been watching the industry with an eye that missed little. He sought not merely actresses, but vessels through which tension and desire could flow. In Grace Kelly, he found such a vessel, not because she clamored for attention, but because she withheld it, drawing the eye as much by restraint as by revelation. It was in Dial M for Murder that Hitchcock first cast her, and in doing so, he began to sculpt the image that would become inseparable from her name. Grace played Margot Wendy's, the elegant wife entangled in a plot of betrayal and attempted murder. The role demanded not only beauty, but also a kind of controlled vulnerability, a sense of danger beneath the smooth surface. Hitchcock, with his meticulous direction, coaxed from her the qualities he prized: coolness, composure, the ability to suggest depths without ever quite showing them. On the set, Grace proved herself a professional of rare discipline. She arrived prepared. She listened. She absorbed every instruction. Hitchcock admired her obedience, her willingness to surrender herself to the demands of the role. Yet there was more than obedience in her performance. There was an inner life glimpsed in fleeting glances, in the way her eyes seemed to hold back more than they revealed. It was this tension, this sense of withheld fire that made her irresistible to the camera. The film's success brought her into greater light, but it also began to shape the mold in which she would be cast. Hitchcock saw in her the archetype of what he later described as the icy blonde, a woman whose elegance and restraint concealed passion, a figure who stirred desire precisely because she did not yield easily. In Grace, this archetype found its most perfect expression. Yet one may wonder, did Grace recognize the danger of being so defined? Did she sense that in embodying the role so well, she might be forever confined to its shadow? Following Dial M for Murder, Hitchcock cast her again, this time in Rear Window. Here, opposite James Stewart, Grace played Lisa Fremont, the sophisticated socialite who enters the darkened apartment of a man immobilized by injury, only to become entangled in his voyeuristic obsession with a possible crime. The role demanded not only glamour, but also courage, as Lisa moves from the world of fashion and refinement into the dangerous pursuit of truth. Grace's performance in Rear Window was luminous. Draped in couture gowns, she embodied elegance, yet her movements carried a determination that defied the stereotype of passivity. Critics marveled at the way she combined beauty with strength, restraint with daring. Hitchcock, ever the craftsman, filmed her with adoration, framing her in ways that emphasized both her distance and her allure. The camera lingered on her face, her hands, her quiet confidence, as though she were less an actress than an apparition conjured by light. In those moments, audiences around the world were captivated. Grace Kelly was no longer a rising star. She was a presence, a symbol of refinement and mystery. Yet beneath the surface of such acclaim lay the same paradox that had haunted her since childhood. The world admired her for the very qualities that set her apart, yet those same qualities often kept her isolated. She was celebrated for being untouchable, and in that celebration, she was set apart even more. The collaboration with Hitchcock deepened with To Catch a Thief, filmed on the sunlit French Riviera. Opposite Cary Grant, Grace played Frances Stevens, the wealthy young woman whose elegance masks a playful daring. The film shimmered with color and charm, the Mediterranean landscape itself seeming to conspire with Hitchcock's lens to create a vision of beauty. Here, Grace was not only the icy blonde, but also the embodiment of leisure, wealth, and allure. Viewers were entranced, critics charmed, and Grace's image as both star and goddess was sealed. And yet, even amid the laughter and glitter of filming, one may imagine Grace pausing to reflect. Did she feel herself slipping further into a role she had not chosen, a role shaped by the desires of others? Or did she embrace the paradox, finding in it a strange kind of power? Perhaps she sensed, while gazing at the Riviera's horizon, that her path was leading her toward another world altogether, one where glamour would blend with duty in ways she could scarcely foresee. Hitchcock, for his part, adored her professionalism and her presence. He often spoke of her as the ideal actress, composed, disciplined, never unruly. Yet he also spoke of her as though she were an object, a symbol rather than a woman. In his eyes, she was the embodiment of a dream he could shape but never fully possess. Grace perhaps understood this. She accepted his direction, played her roles with grace, but maintained a distance that preserved her own sense of self. She was willing to be the dream, but she would not surrender entirely to another's gaze. It was during these years that she won the Academy Award for her performance in The Country Girl, a role that diverged from Hitchcock's vision. Here, she played Georgie Elgin, the weary wife of an alcoholic actor, stripped of glamour, dressed in plain clothes, her beauty subdued. Critics were astonished. Grace, the cool goddess, revealed vulnerability, strength, and emotional depth. The award affirmed what she had always longed to prove, that she was not merely an image, but an actress of substance. Yet even this triumph carried its ambiguities. Did she win because she shed her beauty, or because she revealed, if only briefly, the inner woman she had always concealed? One may pause here as the reel flickers with images of Grace in satin gowns and then in plain attire, and ask, which was the real Grace? Was she the glamorous apparition adored by Hitchcock's lens, or the weary, resilient woman of The Country Girl? Or was she neither, but something in between, a soul forever negotiating the distance between image and self? As her fame grew, so too did the attention of the world beyond cinema. Photographers followed her, magazines celebrated her, society embraced her as the epitome of elegance. Yet Grace remained, as always, poised and restrained, never indulging in scandal, never losing control. The world projected fantasies onto her, and she, with characteristic discipline, carried them as though they were another costume to be worn with dignity. The candle of her childhood, once flickering in solitude, now blazed upon screens across continents. Yet its light, though steady, cast shadows as well. For the very qualities that brought her acclaim were also those that separated her, that confined her to roles of elegance and distance. And even as she smiled for the cameras, perhaps she wondered whether the applause was for her true self, or only for the dream she had become. The applause faded into the sound of waves against stone, the echo of the Mediterranean coastline where she had filmed To Catch a Thief. It is upon that coast, in the shadow of Monaco, that her next chapter awaited, the meeting with a prince, the transformation of an actress into a princess, and the exchange of one kind of stage for another. The sound of the waves against stone lingered like a heartbeat, steady and eternal, as if reminding her that every triumph was but a moment against the vastness of time. From that sunlit Riviera, Grace Kelly returned not only to Hollywood, but to the summit of her profession, where applause thundered like a storm and yet carried with it the faint ache of parting. For it was in this season of her life that she achieved the pinnacle of recognition, receiving the golden statue of the Academy, even as her footsteps began to turn toward another world entirely. The role that brought her this highest honor was far from the shimmering gowns and jeweled perfection of Hitchcock's creations. In The Country Girl, released in 1954, she played Georgie Elgin, the weary wife of a failing actor, a woman worn down by disillusion and the slow erosion of hope. Grace set aside her finery, dressed in plain clothes, her hair subdued, her beauty concealed beneath the weight of ordinary suffering. The transformation astonished those who had regarded her as little more than a goddess of ice and light. Here, she revealed the quiet resilience of a woman carrying burdens unseen by the world. On screen, her performance was haunting in its restraint. She did not seek sympathy by raising her voice or shedding obvious tears. Instead, she let silence speak, her eyes carrying the fatigue of years, her movements slow, deliberate, heavy with unspoken pain. Opposite Bing Crosby, who played her broken husband, she offered not glamour but truth, not distance but intimacy. The critics, accustomed to praising her elegance, now praised her courage. She had not only acted, she had surrendered herself to a role that stripped her bare. When her name was called at the Academy Awards of 1955, Grace rose with her characteristic composure, walked gracefully to the stage, and accepted the statue with words that were both humble and precise. She did not tremble. She did not weep. Instead, she gave thanks with the same dignity that had always marked her, leaving the world to marvel at the paradox of a woman who could reveal so much on screen, yet reveal so little of herself in life. The applause filled the hall, yet within it one wonders what she felt. Triumph, certainly. Vindication, perhaps. But was there also a trace of melancholy, knowing that the height of one mountain often reveals the distance to another? The victory cemented her place among the greatest actresses of her generation. She was no longer simply the cool beauty framed by Hitchcock's lens. She was a woman of depth, capable of inhabiting roles that demanded vulnerability. Yet this recognition came at a time when her life was already beginning to turn in a new direction. The roles offered to her grew grander, yet so, too, did the demands of a world that seemed unable to let her simply exist. Every gesture, every appearance was noted, every photograph studied, as though the world wished to own not only her image but her very essence. Hitchcock, who had shaped so much of her cinematic persona, longed to continue working with her. He spoke of projects designed for her, films that would deepen her legend. Yet fate was already weaving another thread, one that would lead her away from the studios of Hollywood and into the gilded halls of a palace by the sea. The Riviera, where she had filmed To Catch a Thief, would become not only a backdrop but a destiny. Before that destiny arrived, she continued to act, gracing screens with performances that carried her trademark blend of elegance and mystery. Each role seemed to confirm her as the embodiment of a certain ideal, untouchable, yet alluring, cool, yet burning with hidden fire. The paradox followed her like a shadow, and though she carried it with poise, she must have felt the weight of its persistence. Did she fear being forever bound to the archetype she had perfected? Or did she accept it as the price of recognition, a mask she wore even as she longed for freedom beneath it? Her public life grew dazzling, yet her private life remained closely guarded. Suitors pursued her, rumors swirled, yet she revealed little. Men of power and renown were said to admire her, from actors to politicians, yet she carried herself always with the same reserve. She did not court scandal, nor did she indulge in the recklessness that often ensnared others in her profession. Her dignity became her shield, her silence her protection. Still, the world could not resist speculating. Every smile, every glance became a subject of rumor, as though the world believed that a woman so poised must surely conceal passions unspoken. And perhaps she did, for within her lived the child who had once arranged dolls upon a stage, who had whispered poetry into the night, who had longed for a world beyond the expectations of her family. That inner life remained, hidden but persistent, shaping her choices even as the world pressed its fantasies upon her. It was this inner life, perhaps, that drew her toward a destiny unlike any other, a destiny that would demand not only her art, but her very freedom. The Academy Award glittering in her hands symbolized both triumph and conclusion. For though it marked her as one of the greatest of her age, it also arrived at the threshold of her departure from the world of film. The applause of Hollywood, once the summit of her ambition, would soon be replaced by the rituals of monarchy, by ceremonies that were not staged, but lived. Did she know, as she held the golden statue, that she would never again return to claim another? Did she sense that the life she had built through discipline and artistry was already beginning to fade into memory? The night of her victory must have shimmered with brilliance. The lights of Los Angeles glowed, the city pulsed with celebration, and Grace, dressed in her signature refinement, stood at the center of admiration. Yet even as the champagne flowed and voices rose in praise, the waves of the Riviera still sounded in her memory, calling her to another shore. And so, the candle that had flickered through her childhood, the shutter that had whispered in her youth, the reel that had spun with her early roles, all of these now seemed to converge in a single moment of recognition, a moment both radiant and sorrowful. For in the very hour of her greatest acclaim, Grace Kelly stood at the edge of farewell, poised to step away from the stage forever. The applause lingered, echoing in the great hall, then faded into the softer sounds of the Mediterranean once more, the lapping of waves against stone, the murmur of voices in French along the Riviera, and the quiet laughter of a prince waiting in the wings of her destiny. The laughter by the Riviera lingered like music carried upon the breeze, mingling with the lapping of waves against stone, and into that music stepped the world of To Catch a Thief. The film was, on the surface, a tale of elegance and intrigue, of jewels stolen and lovers sparring beneath the Mediterranean sun. Yet for Grace Kelly, it became more than another role. It was here, amid the mountains and coastlines of Monaco and the French Riviera, that her life and her destiny touched hands for the first time, as though the landscape itself had been preparing a stage far greater than cinema. The production unfolded in 1954, with Alfred Hitchcock once again shaping her performance and Cary Grant standing beside her as the charming thief. The air was bright with summer, the horizon a line of shimmering blue, and every scene seemed to echo with a sense of leisure and luxury. Grace, playing the wealthy Frances Stevens, was dressed in gowns that flowed like water, her figure framed by the grandeur of the Côte d'Azur. Audiences would later marvel at the color and beauty of the film, but for Grace, the experience carried a different weight. She was not merely acting in Monaco, she was encountering a place that would one day claim her entirely. The filming itself was filled with moments of elegance and play. Cary Grant, already seasoned and wry, brought humor to the set, and Hitchcock, though demanding as ever, reveled in the chance to frame Grace against the Riviera's landscapes. There is a scene often remembered where Grace and Grant drive along the winding coastal roads, cliffs falling away into the sea, sunlight glinting on the water. In the film, it was glamour, suspense, romance. In life, it was foreshadowing, an image that would later return with tragic finality. Did she feel, as the car moved along those serpentine roads, some faint premonition of the role those very paths would play in her story? Or did the brightness of youth and success shield her from such shadows? When not filming, Grace explored the region. She visited gardens scented with lavender, strolled narrow streets where shutters creaked in the wind, and gazed out from balconies where the Mediterranean spread like an endless sheet of glass. The air itself seemed charged with destiny, though she could not yet name it. Here, in these quiet moments, she may have felt both freedom and belonging, a sense that this land was somehow familiar to her soul, even though she'd been born far away across the ocean. The film was released to acclaim, audiences enchanted by its beauty, critics charmed by its lightness. For Grace, it marked another ascent in her career, another step in her transformation from actress to icon. Yet it was not merely the success of the film that stayed with her, it was the memory of the Riviera, the sound of the waves, the scent of the air, the feeling of sunlight upon her skin. These impressions lingered like fragments of a dream, waiting for their meaning to unfold. In interviews following the film, Grace spoke of the beauty of the location, of the joy of working in such surroundings. She smiled with her usual composure, her words measured, her tone calm. Yet behind the smile, one might imagine a private longing, a sense that she had glimpsed something more than scenery, something that touched the deeper rhythms of her life. Perhaps she already felt the stirrings of change, though she kept them close, hidden behind her veil of elegance. The world, meanwhile, saw only triumph. To Catch a Thief reinforced her image as the embodiment of sophistication, the woman who seemed at home in the most glamorous of settings. Hitchcock, satisfied with his creation, regarded her as his ideal heroine, the perfect blend of beauty and restraint. Audiences adored her, magazines celebrated her, and Hollywood prepared to offer her more. Yet destiny was already moving beyond the reach of studios and directors, beyond the applause of theaters. The Riviera, with its cliffs and its waves, had introduced her to the place where she would become not merely an actress, but a princess. For it was during the following year, at the Cannes Film Festival, that Grace Kelly would meet Prince Rainier III of Monaco, a meeting orchestrated yet serendipitous, formal yet fateful, and the laughter that once accompanied the filming of a light-hearted romance would give way to the solemn vows of a royal marriage. One might pause to consider the delicate irony of this moment. On screen, she played a woman of wealth and freedom, a figure who flirted with danger yet remained untethered, unbound. Off-screen, she was moving toward a life that would bind her more tightly than any script could have imagined, a life of duty, tradition, and scrutiny. Did she sense, in the final days of filming, that she was stepping from one stage into another? Did she understand that the sunlight and laughter of those Riviera scenes would one day return as memory, tinged with both sweetness and sorrow? As To Catch a Thief brought her further acclaim, she also felt the weight of choices before her. Hollywood, for all its glitter, was a world of demands, of endless scrutiny, of roles that sometimes revealed but often confined. The Academy Award had proven her artistry, yet the industry still sought her mainly for the qualities Hitchcock had defined. Perhaps then, the thought of another life, one beyond the endless cycle of scripts and sets, held a strange allure. The waves continued their rhythm, steady and eternal, even as her life prepared to shift. Grace Kelly, the actress who had conquered Hollywood with restraint and elegance, was about to step into a role that no director could script, no studio could contain. The stage would be Monaco, the audience the world, and the role, Princess of a Principality, would demand of her not performance, but sacrifice. The laughter of Cary Grant, the guiding hand of Hitchcock, the applause of Hollywood, all these sounds began to fade, replaced by the quieter murmur of destiny preparing its lines. And at the threshold of that destiny stood a prince, waiting in his palace by the sea, where the waves would continue to echo long after the lights of Hollywood had dimmed. The murmur of destiny followed her from the bright sets of Hitchcock's Riviera to the crowded promenades of Cannes, where the film festival of 1955 gathered stars, journalists, and dignitaries into a glittering assembly by the sea. The air was thick with perfume and cigarette smoke, with laughter and speculation, and the click of cameras sounded like a chorus of crickets in the warm night. It was here, amid the fever of cinema's celebration, that Grace Kelly was asked to meet a man whose life would alter her own forever, a man not of Hollywood, but of monarchy, Prince Rainier III of Monaco. The meeting did not occur by chance. Behind the scenes, journalists and organizers whispered and schemed, imagining the elegance of Hollywood entwined with the solemnity of European royalty. Grace, ever dutiful in her public appearances, agreed to a carefully arranged visit to the Palace of Monaco, a place she had glimpsed only during the filming of To Catch a Thief. She prepared herself with the same composure she brought to every public occasion, wearing a gown of floral silk, her hair pinned with understated grace. Yet one can imagine her private thoughts, the hesitation of a woman accustomed to scripts, now stepping into a scene for which no lines had been written. The palace itself, perched above the sea, bore the marks of history, its walls whispering of centuries of rule, its halls echoing with both grandeur and loneliness. Into this space she was led, cameras trailing, attendants watching, and there stood Rainier, tall, reserved, his demeanor both formal and searching. He was not the romantic figure of film, but a ruler, burdened with the duty of a tiny principality wedged between sea and mountain. His gaze upon Grace was measured, curious, perhaps cautious, as though he too wondered what part destiny had written for him. Their conversation, preserved in fragments and recollections, was polite, even hesitant. They walked through the palace gardens, the spring light filtering through orange trees, the scent of blossoms mingling with the salt of the nearby sea. Grace, with her poised manners, spoke of film and art, of the beauty she had seen along the coast. Rainier, with his careful reserve, spoke of Monaco, its history, its traditions, its struggles to maintain dignity amid the shadow of larger nations. It was not a meeting of sudden passion, but of curiosity, of two figures circling one another like dancers learning the first steps of a cautious waltz. And yet, beneath the formality, something lingered. Grace, who had lived in a world of cameras and applause, may have sensed in Rainier the gravity of a different kind of stage, one where every gesture was ritual and every silence carried weight. Rainier, who had ruled since the death of his father, may have seen in Grace not merely beauty, but the promise of refinement, a figure who could elevate Monaco in the eyes of the world. What began as an orchestrated encounter soon grew into a correspondence, letters carried across the ocean, words chosen with the same care that both had always practiced. The world, of course, was quick to speculate. Newspapers filled with photographs, rumors fluttered like moths to a flame, and the notion of a Hollywood star becoming a princess was too enchanting to ignore. Yet Grace guarded her heart closely. She'd always been cautious, always aware of the difference between appearance and reality. Did she see in Rainier a chance for genuine partnership, or did she sense, even then, that the path before her would be more duty than dream? Her family, when told of the prince's interest, responded with mixed voices. Her father, who had once doubted her acting career, now saw in this union the validation of ambition, a daughter not only successful in cinema, but now poised to ascend into royalty. Her mother, always more restrained, counseled caution, reminding Grace that marriage to a monarch was not the same as a romance, but a lifelong binding to tradition and scrutiny. Grace herself remained composed, her words to friends measured, her feelings revealed only in fragments. She was intrigued, perhaps flattered, but also wary. As the correspondence deepened, Rainier traveled to America to see her again. It was Christmas of 1955 when he arrived in Philadelphia, meeting her family, stepping into the warmth and bustle of the Kelly household. The contrast could not have been greater, his European formality against the exuberance of an American family gathered for holiday. Yet he endured it with grace, and Grace herself must have felt the odd collision of two worlds she inhabited, the strict expectations of her family and the solemn traditions of monarchy. Their engagement, announced soon after, was received with astonishment and delight. The newspapers called it a fairy tale, the union of Hollywood and royalty, beauty and power. Photographers rushed to capture her ring, her smile, his steady presence at her side. Yet beneath the glitter of headlines, the truth was more complex. For this was not only a marriage of affection, but also of necessity. Rainier, pressured to secure the future of Monaco, needed an heir, and Grace, whose image carried the allure of American modernity and cinematic grace, seemed the perfect partner. And so, the decision was made. Grace would leave Hollywood, leave her art, leave the world she had built, and step into a role that could not be cast aside. Did she weep in private as she signed contracts severing her ties to film studios, or did she steel herself with the discipline she had always carried? Did she believe she was walking into a true fairy tale, or did she already sense that the crown she would wear would be heavier than any role she had played? The waves of the Riviera, the same that had carried her laughter with Cary Grant, now seemed to murmur with solemnity, as though reminding her that joy and sacrifice often come entwined. She had glimpsed Monaco as a backdrop for cinema. Now it awaited her as the stage of her life. The murmur of destiny, once faint, had become a voice, and Grace Kelly, actress and Academy Award winner, was about to step across an invisible threshold into a new existence. The palace gates stood open, the world watched, and in the distance the waves continued their rhythm, eternal and indifferent, as though whispering both welcome and warning. The palace gates stood open, and beyond them stretched not only stone courtyards and echoing halls, but the gaze of a world eager to witness a union that seemed drawn from myth. The engagement of Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier III of Monaco was announced in January 1956, and at once the headlines proclaimed it a fairy tale. Hollywood's reigning goddess of cool elegance would wed a sovereign prince, and the story spread across continents as though it belonged not to one nation or one people, but to the collective imagination of an age hungry for wonder. Grace, who had long carried herself with reserve, now found herself at the center of a spectacle. Every glance she cast was captured, every word she spoke repeated, every gesture analyzed for signs of affection or doubt. The ring upon her finger glinted like a symbol, not only of love but of transition, of a passage from one world to another. For with the acceptance of Rainier's proposal, she had also accepted the end of her career as an actress. Studios that had courted her with contracts and directors who had envisioned roles for her now received quiet letters of farewell. Hollywood, which had crowned her with its highest honor, was losing her to a palace by the sea. There was grandeur in the decision, yet there was also melancholy. For Grace, acting had been more than a profession. It had been her voice, her outlet, her sanctuary. On screen, she had found a way to reconcile the silence of her youth with the longing for expression. To step away from it was not simply to change direction, but to surrender a part of herself. Still, she accepted the sacrifice with her characteristic composure, as though she had always understood that her life would demand such choices. Did she believe, in those quiet hours of farewell, that the role of princess would offer her equal fulfillment? Or did she tell herself, with steady discipline, that fulfillment was no longer hers to seek, but duty hers to embody? The world, of course, saw only enchantment. In April 1956, the marriage was set to take place in Monaco, and preparations began for a ceremony that would rival any in memory. Hollywood stars were invited, European nobility confirmed their presence, and journalists from across the globe descended upon the tiny principality. It was said that more than 30 million people would watch the wedding broadcast on television, a number unprecedented for the time. The palace, once the quiet seat of a small nation, now became the stage of a global drama. Before sailing for Europe, Grace bid farewell to Hollywood at the Academy Awards. She appeared not as nominee but as presenter, her presence on the stage a poignant symbol of closure. Audiences, aware that they were seeing her for the last time in such a role, applauded with both admiration and sorrow. The lights shone upon her one final time as an actress, and then faded, leaving behind the shadow of what might have been. One imagines her stepping away from that stage with grace, but also with the faint ache of parting, like a singer who leaves a song unfinished. Her voyage to Monaco began aboard the SS Constitution, a ship that carried her across the Atlantic with family, friends, and an entourage of press. The journey itself became part of the spectacle. Crowds gathered at ports to glimpse her departure. Photographers filled their rolls with images of the bride-to-be, leaning against railings, her hair swept by the ocean wind. She smiled as she always had, composed and radiant, yet her letters from the journey reveal a quieter heart. She confessed to feelings of exhaustion, of being overwhelmed by the relentless attention, of longing for moments of solitude. Even amid celebration, she remained aware of the solitude that destiny had always carried within her. The arrival in Monaco was unlike anything she had ever known. The harbor, usually quiet with fishing boats and small vessels, overflowed with yachts, press barges, and crowds that pressed against the edges of the sea. Banners waved, church bells rang, and the air was filled with cheers. The people of Monaco, whose nation was scarcely larger than a city, embraced her as though she were their own. Yet one must wonder what Grace herself felt as she stepped ashore, her every move broadcast, her every smile magnified. Did she feel welcomed, or did she feel consumed, as though her very self was being dissolved into the pageantry of a fairy tale she had not entirely written? The civil ceremony took place on April 18th, followed by the religious wedding on April 19th, each steeped in tradition and grandeur. Grace's gown, designed by Helen Rose of MGM, became one of the most iconic bridal dresses of all time, its lace and silk embodying both purity and majesty. She walked through the cathedral with a serenity that seemed almost otherworldly, her veil trailing like mist, her face radiant yet solemn. Rainier stood beside her, steady and dignified, a prince who now held not only a crown, but a wife whose fame had eclipsed his own. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the world rejoiced. Millions watched on television, their living rooms transformed into witnesses of history. For a few hours, the burdens of nations and the wounds of a weary world seemed set aside, replaced by the enchantment of a marriage that joined cinema's brightest star with royalty's solemn tradition. Yet even in the midst of this triumph, one cannot help but recall the silence that often lived within Grace. Did she feel herself radiant and fulfilled in that moment? Or did she feel the faint shiver of sacrifice, the knowledge that her independence had been set aside forever? After the ceremonies, the celebrations lasted for days. Banquets were held, dances arranged, speeches given. The streets of Monaco glowed with lights, and the sea reflected their brilliance. Grace appeared at Rainier's side, smiling with dignity, her presence as luminous as ever. Yet within the palace walls, when the lights dimmed and the music faded, she entered a life far different from the one she had known. No longer would she be guided by scripts or directors. Now she was bound by protocols, by the expectations of a principality, by the gaze of subjects who saw in her not an actress, but a princess. The applause of Hollywood had faded into the cheers of Monaco, but applause is never without cost. Grace Kelly, who had once held an Academy Award in her hands, now held the weight of a crown, invisible yet unyielding. The world called it a fairy tale, but fairy tales, when lived, are often more solemn than they seem. The lights of Monaco's celebration slowly dimmed, leaving behind the soft echo of footsteps in palace corridors. And in those corridors, where tapestries whispered of centuries past, Grace began to walk her new path, an actress no longer, but a princess, surrounded by silence that was heavier than any stage curtain she had ever drawn. The lights of Monaco's celebrations dimmed, leaving behind the hushed corridors of the palace, where the scent of candle wax lingered in the air and the echo of footsteps trailed off into silence. Yet beyond those quiet halls, the memory of the wedding still shimmered. For the union of Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier III had been more than a ceremony. It had been a spectacle that the world consumed as if it were a dream unfolding before their eyes. The grandeur of those April days in 1956 remained etched in the minds of millions, a vision of lace, jewels, and solemn vows that seemed to seal a fairy tale into permanence. The Cathedral of St. Nicholas, where the religious ceremony was held, bore within its walls the weight of centuries. Stone columns rose into shadows, stained glass filtered the light into jeweled fragments, and incense curled in the air like whispers of devotion. Into this sacred space Grace entered, her gown a marvel of craftsmanship, created from yards of silk taffeta and antique lace, its veil flowing like a river of mist. Designed by Helen Rose, the dress seemed to embody not only bridal purity, but also the merging of cinema's artistry with monarchy's tradition. It was, in itself, a kind of performance, though one that transcended the screen. The congregation gathered in solemn witness. Royalty from across Europe, leaders of state, Hollywood stars, journalists, and citizens of Monaco all turned their eyes upon the bride. Rainier, in full uniform, stood at the altar, his expression calm, yet weighted with the knowledge that this moment was as much about the future of his principality as about love. Grace moved toward him with a serenity that seemed unearthly, her composure never faltering, her beauty softened by the gravity of the occasion. Together they spoke their vows, their voices carrying through the vast cathedral, binding not only themselves, but also two worlds, Hollywood and monarchy, modernity and tradition. For those watching on television, the images seemed almost otherworldly. The camera lingered on her face, on the delicate lace framing her features, on the golden light of the altar that seemed to sanctify her transformation. In living rooms across America and Europe, families sat in awe, believing they had witnessed the perfect union of fantasy and reality. For them, the fairy tale was alive. But within the bride herself, perhaps there stirred a quieter current. Did she feel, in the moment of vows, the weight of what she was relinquishing? Did she recall the stages and film sets, the roles left behind, the scripts she would never again read? The crown she now carried was invisible, yet its presence was immediate and irrevocable. After the vows, the rituals unfolded with precision. Music swelled, choirs sang, and the procession moved slowly down the aisle. Outside, the crowds erupted in joy, their cheers rising into the spring air as the new princess appeared with her husband. The streets of Monaco were festooned with flowers, banners, and flags, the sea itself dotted with boats that sounded horns in celebration. From balconies, children waved, and from the press galleries, cameras flashed like lightning. Grace, now Princess of Monaco, smiled with dignity, her gestures calm, her every movement imbued with the knowledge that she was no longer her own. The reception that followed was as lavish as any in memory. Banquets laden with silver and crystal stretched beneath vaulted ceilings. Toasts were made, speeches delivered, and the couple moved from one gathering to another, their faces always observed, their presence always noted. Hollywood stars mingled with European nobility. Journalists scribbled their impressions, and photographers sought to capture every detail. The union of actress and prince was not only a personal marriage, it was a political and cultural event, a spectacle designed to ensure Monaco's future and to enchant a world weary of war and longing for beauty. Yet amid the grandeur, there must have been moments when Grace longed for solitude. Her nature had always been private, her heart always seeking quiet spaces. Now she was enveloped in ritual and scrutiny, her every glance magnified, her every word recorded. Within the palace walls, she must have felt the vastness of her new life, a vastness both splendid and confining. The applause of the world had been replaced by the gaze of subjects, and applause fades, but gaze endures. The days following the wedding were filled with ceremonies, official duties, and endless receptions. Grace carried herself with the same composure she had always shown, never faltering, never betraying fatigue. Yet in private letters, she confessed to exhaustion, to the difficulty of adjusting to a world where spontaneity was nearly impossible. Everything was prescribed, every action weighed. She had stepped from one stage into another, but the script here was unyielding and the audience unceasing. The gown, carefully preserved, was later placed in a museum, admired by generations as a symbol of perfection. But clothing, however beautiful, does not reveal the heart within it. The veil that had shimmered with light on that April day may also have symbolized the veiling of Grace's own independence. For in marrying Rainier, she had not only gained a title, she had lost the freedom to choose her roles, to pursue her craft, to live as she once had. The transformation was complete, and with it came both majesty and sacrifice. The world remembered the brilliance, the spectacle, the fairy tale made flesh. But Grace herself, walking through the palace corridors in the days after the celebrations ended, may have felt the quiet weight of a new reality. The halls were filled with tapestries and portraits of past rulers, each bearing the solemn faces of those who had carried duty before her. Their eyes, painted and eternal, seemed to watch her as she passed, reminding her that she, too, was now bound to this lineage, that her life was no longer her own, but part of the story of a nation. The cathedral bells that had rung so joyously at her wedding faded into daily rhythms, and Grace Kelly, actress, Academy Award winner, daughter of Philadelphia, became Princess Grace of Monaco. The transition was complete, yet the question remained, had she stepped into a life of fulfillment or into a gilded prison? Did she believe, in those quiet first nights as princess, that love would be enough to sustain her through the loss of her art, her independence, her former self? The answer, perhaps, lay not in words, but in silence. The same silence she had carried since childhood, the same silence that had made her seem distant, mysterious, unapproachable. Now that silence would serve her again, a shield against scrutiny, a companion in solitude, a veil beneath the crown. And so, the grandeur of the wedding, the applause of millions, the brilliance of lace and light, all faded into the sound of her footsteps upon stone floors, echoing through corridors where the shadows of history lingered. It was there, in those quiet halls, that the true test of her life began. The echo of her footsteps along the stone corridors carried her into the days that followed the wedding, when the bells had ceased their joyous tolling and the streets of Monaco returned to their daily rhythm. The palace, with its grand facades and views of the Mediterranean, was no longer the setting for celebration, but the space of her new existence, a place both regal and enclosed. For Grace, these early days of royal life were marked not by triumph, but by transition, a period of learning, adjustment, and quiet sacrifice. Etiquette lessons filled her hours, taught by court officials who carried with them the gravity of centuries. Every movement had a protocol, every gesture a significance. How to address dignitaries, how to enter a room, how to bow, how to sit. Grace, who had once learned to walk for the camera, now learned to walk for the crown. The rules were unspoken, yet absolute, and behind each instruction was the reminder that she no longer represented only herself, but a nation, small yet proud, ancient yet fragile. In public, she carried these lessons flawlessly. She smiled with serenity, spoke with precision, and moved with the same grace that had always marked her presence. Crowds greeted her with admiration, their new princess embodying the elegance of cinema and the dignity of royalty. Yet behind closed doors, she confessed to friends that the weight of expectation was heavier than she had imagined. Every choice was scrutinized, every word measured, and spontaneity seemed to vanish. Where once she had found freedom in the fluidity of acting, now she was bound to the rigidity of tradition. Homesickness began to stir within her. The palace walls, thick with history, seemed at times to press in upon her, and she missed the familiar rhythm of America, the chatter of New York streets, the warmth of her family's gatherings, the ease of conversation unburdened by protocol. Letters to her mother carried hints of longing, notes of uncertainty, though always couched in the measured tone she had mastered. She was not one to complain openly, but the undercurrent of solitude was unmistakable. The palace itself was beautiful, yet austere. Its high ceilings and echoing halls spoke of grandeur, but for Grace they could feel cold, like a stage left empty after the curtain fell. She wandered through rooms adorned with portraits of past rulers, their faces solemn, their eyes eternal. And she must have wondered how many of them had felt the same isolation, the same mixture of pride and restraint. The Mediterranean spread out below, endless and glittering, yet even its openness could not dissolve the sense of confinement that life within the palace imposed. The people of Monaco adored her. To them, she was a living symbol of modernity and glamour, a link between their tiny principality and the vast world beyond. Her presence drew attention to Monaco in ways Rainier alone never could. Tourists arrived, journalists lingered, and the name of the nation echoed across continents. Grace understood this role and played it with dignity, appearing at public functions, attending ceremonies, visiting hospitals, always poised, always smiling. But beneath the smiles, she often felt the ache of invisibility. The sense that the woman within her, the actress, the dreamer, had been subsumed by the princess. It was not only public duty that demanded her adjustment, but private life as well. Marriage to Rainier brought with it the complexities of two strong personalities. Rainier, though dignified and affectionate in public, was also a ruler, accustomed to authority, sensitive to appearances, protective of tradition. Grace, disciplined and dutiful, tried to adapt, yet there were moments when her quiet independence brushed against his firmness. Rumors of tension, though muted, began to circulate, whispered in corners of the press. But within the palace, disagreements remained hidden, contained within the silence that Grace had always carried. Still, there were moments of tenderness. The couple shared walks through the palace gardens, dinners overlooking the sea, conversations about art, culture, and the future of Monaco. Rainier admired her composure, her intelligence, her ability to bring prestige to his realm. Grace, in turn, respected his sense of duty, his devotion to his people. Yet respect and admiration are not always enough to dissolve solitude, and in Grace's heart, the absence of her old life often echoed like a hollow space. Friends who visited noticed the change. The woman who had once thrived on sets, who had engaged with directors and actors, now lived in a world defined by ceremony. She no longer read scripts, no longer rehearsed lines, no longer transformed herself into characters that allowed her expression. Instead, she transformed herself into the role of princess. And while she played it with perfection, it was a role without end, without curtain, without reprieve. One can imagine her in those first months, standing at a palace window, gazing out at the Mediterranean. The light shimmered on the water, the waves whispered their endless song, and yet the freedom they suggested was distant, unreachable. Did she recall the days when she had driven along those same coastal roads with Cary Grant, the laughter of cinema echoing in her ears? Did she wonder if she had traded one illusion for another, one stage for another audience, one script for another set of lines? Her solitude was deepened by the absence of her homeland. Though she was embraced by Monaco, she was still an outsider, an American in a European court. Her accent marked her, her background set her apart, and though she softened her presence with dignity, she could never entirely dissolve the difference. This duality, belonging and not belonging, became another thread in the tapestry of her life, a tension that would never fully ease. And yet, despite the weight of these adjustments, Grace carried herself with unwavering poise. She did not falter in her duties, did not reveal her struggles in public, did not rebel against the constraints of her new life. Instead, she adapted as she had always adapted, transforming solitude into composure, uncertainty into discipline. She became, once more, the silent flame, steady, luminous, yet always wavering in the unseen draft of longing. The corridors of the palace remained vast and echoing, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. Within them, Grace walked with measured steps, her gown brushing against stone floors, her thoughts perhaps wandering to the stages she had left behind. The silence of those halls was profound, and it lingered like a question unanswered. And it is through that silence we pass into the next chapter of her life, when the solitude of adjustment gave way to the presence of children, whose laughter and cries would fill the palace with new sounds, softening its austerity, yet adding to the complexity of her role as mother and princess. The silence of the palace, once heavy and echoing, began to soften with the sound of children's voices. For in the years that followed her marriage, Grace entered the chapter of motherhood. Laughter and cries now threaded through the long corridors, filling the spaces where once only duty had walked. The echo of her own footsteps was joined by smaller ones, uncertain and hurried, and the hush of ritual was tempered by the spontaneity of new life. It was in these years that Grace, the actress who had surrendered her stage, found a different kind of role, one less scripted yet no less demanding, the role of mother to heirs who would carry Monaco's fragile future. Her first child, Princess Caroline, was born in 1957, followed by Prince Albert in 1958, and later Princess Stephanie in 1965. Each birth was celebrated not only within the palace but across Monaco, for every child represented continuity, stability, and hope for the principality. The people adored the sight of their princess cradling her infants, her poise softened into tenderness, her reserve warmed by maternal affection. To the world, these images seemed to confirm the fairy tale. Grace Kelly, once the untouchable star, now radiant with children at her side, fulfilling her destiny with grace. Yet motherhood, though joyous, was also another form of duty. The children she bore were not only her own, but heirs of a dynasty, their lives shaped by the demands of succession, their upbringing scrutinized by the press and guided by tradition. Grace, who had once sought to define her own path, now faced the challenge of guiding her children through a path already determined. In her private heart, she must have wrestled with the tension between maternal instinct and royal expectation. Did she long to shield them from the weight of legacy, to let them grow freely as she once longed to do? Or did she accept, with resignation, that their lives would be no less bound than her own? The palace, transformed by the presence of children, became both home and stage. Nannies and tutors arrived. Schedules were imposed. Lessons of etiquette began almost as soon as they could walk. Caroline, spirited and independent, tested boundaries. Albert, the heir, was raised with the gravity of responsibility. And Stephanie, the youngest, would later embody rebellion against the very traditions that surrounded her. Grace loved them deeply, but her love was carried out under the gaze of a nation. Every outing, every photograph, every public appearance was analyzed. The simple act of holding her children became a symbol, a performance of maternal perfection expected by both her subjects and the world beyond Monaco's borders. And yet, in private, Grace was tender and attentive. She told them stories, sang lullabies, and sought to create within the palace walls moments of warmth that transcended duty. Friends recalled the image of her sitting on the floor with her children, unafraid to let her gown crease, unafraid to let her dignity give way to play. These moments, though unseen by the public, revealed the woman behind the princess, the mother who sought to give her children what she herself had often missed: softness amid expectation. Still, the strains of her dual role were ever present. Rainier, devoted to the stability of Monaco, was often stern, a man of authority before he was a father. Grace, by contrast, yearned for openness, for affection, for the freedom to nurture beyond the confines of protocol. Their differing approaches sometimes led to tension, unspoken yet felt. The children themselves, growing beneath the weight of scrutiny, sensed these currents, and their later lives would bear the marks of both love and restraint. For Grace, motherhood became both fulfillment and confinement. In her children, she found purpose, a joy that softened the loss of her career. Yet in the demands placed upon them, she saw reflections of her own sacrifices. The cycle of expectation repeated, passing from mother to child, from one generation to the next. Did she ever lie awake at night, watching her children sleep, and wonder whether she had given them a gift or a burden by marrying Rainier? Did she whisper silent prayers that they might find freedom where she had lost hers? Publicly, the image was flawless. Photographs of Grace with her children graced magazines worldwide, reinforcing the vision of a perfect family. The people of Monaco adored their princess more than ever, for she embodied not only elegance, but also maternal devotion. Yet beneath the perfection lingered the complexity of reality: arguments, doubts, longings never spoken aloud. The fairy tale, as always, was maintained for the gaze of the world, while the truth lay quietly within the shadows of the palace. There were times when Grace sought to expand her role beyond motherhood and ceremony. She supported charities, promoted cultural events, and sought to bring art and theater into the life of Monaco. These efforts reflected the part of her that had never faded, the actress who loved creativity, the dreamer who longed for beauty beyond duty. Yet Rainier, cautious and protective, often limited her reach, preferring to keep her within the bounds of tradition. This tension deepened her sense of confinement, even as she poured her heart into the lives of her children. The years passed, and the children grew, their personalities emerging with strength. Caroline's independence mirrored her mother's youthful longing. Albert carried the solemnity of inheritance, and Stephanie, in her restless spirit, seemed to embody rebellion against the very structures that defined them all. Grace, watching them, must have felt a mixture of pride and apprehension, joy and sorrow, for she knew that they, too, would face the paradox she had always faced, the distance between self and role, between longing and duty. At night, when the palace quieted and the children slept, Grace often returned to her books, her poetry, her moments of reflection. The candle of her childhood still flickered, though now it burned in secret, illuminating the pages of poems she had long cherished. These quiet hours were hers alone, a space where she could remember who she had been before the crown, before the palace, before the world had claimed her as its symbol. In those moments, perhaps, she felt herself again not as princess, not as actress, but simply as Grace. And yet, morning always returned, with its duties and appearances, its rituals and obligations, the children's laughter, the people's gaze, the weight of the crown, all of these awaited her. She faced them with composure, as she always had, carrying the dual burdens of love and duty with the same steady silence that had marked her life from the beginning. The palace corridors, once empty and echoing, now carried the sounds of youth, of footsteps racing, of laughter spilling into chambers heavy with history. Yet even these joyous sounds could not entirely erase the sense of sacrifice that lingered in their mother's heart. Grace Kelly had become Princess Grace of Monaco, and now she was also mother of heirs. Yet beneath these roles remained the woman who still longed for freedom, still whispered to herself in solitude, still dreamed of the life she had left behind. The sound of children's laughter faded into the hush of whispers, for even as her family grew, rumors began to stir, rumors of strain within the marriage, of distances between husband and wife, of secrets never spoken. And it is into those whispers that we now step, as the fairy tale's brightness begins to darken with shadows of doubt. The laughter of children faded, leaving in its place a hush filled with whispers, the kind that slip through palace corridors and linger in the margins of newspapers. For no fairy tale, however radiant, remains untouched by shadow, and the marriage of Grace and Rainier was no exception. The world saw perfection, a serene princess, a steady prince, 3 children, and a palace overlooking a blue sea. Yet behind the facade, rumors grew, carried in cautious tones by those close enough to notice and amplified by a press eager to pierce the illusion. Whispers spoke of distance between husband and wife, of silences that stretched too long at dinners, of conversations that seemed more formal than intimate. Rainier, weighed by the governance of his principality, was often stern and absorbed in affairs of state. Grace, though dutiful and respectful, remained a woman of imagination and longing, her spirit restless within the confines of ritual. Together they formed an image of unity, but beneath that image were currents unseen. Did they love one another as deeply as the world wished to believe, or had their marriage become more a bond of duty than of passion? The question lingered, unanswered, as questions often do in lives bound by ceremony. In time, rumors spread of Grace seeking companionship beyond the palace. Some spoke of friendships with writers, artists, and men whose presence offered her an escape from the rigidity of royal life. One name whispered was that of the French actor Jean-Pierre Aumont. Another was the fashion designer Oleg Cassini, whom she had once known before her marriage. Others suggested fleeting connections, confidences shared with men who admired her not as princess, but as woman. Whether these stories were true, embellished, or entirely invented, they revealed a truth deeper than fact. The world sensed that Grace, radiant and composed, might also be lonely. Loneliness had always followed her, even in her youth. It was not the loneliness of abandonment, but the solitude of a woman set apart, admired, yet rarely understood. In Hollywood, she had been adored, yet scrutinized, desired, yet judged. In Monaco, she was revered, yet restrained, cherished, yet confined. Small wonder, then, that whispers of secret companionship emerged, for even if her life did not hold such affairs, her image itself seemed to invite the speculation. The cool reserve, the distant elegance, the eyes that concealed as much as they revealed, these qualities created an aura of mystery, and mystery is always fertile ground for rumor. Rainier, for his part, was not immune to similar whispers. His life as ruler demanded alliances, meetings, and appearances that kept him often apart from his wife. He was said to be strict, traditional, a man whose heart was sometimes hidden behind the mask of authority. The marriage, though outwardly steady, was touched by the inevitable frictions of two different worlds colliding, one shaped by Hollywood's imagination, the other by centuries of monarchy's tradition. And so the palace became not only a home, but a theater of contradictions. In public, Grace and Rainier appeared together, dignified, smiling, their children beside them, their gestures flawless. Photographers captured images of a perfect family, and those images traveled across the world, reinforcing the fairy tale. But within the palace walls, life unfolded in subtler tones. Moments of tension, moments of silence, moments where the princess, once an actress, seemed again to be performing for an audience she could not escape. The whispers grew louder with time, carried by journalists who fed on mystery. Some stories painted Grace as a woman yearning for lost independence, seeking solace in private friendships. Others cast Rainier as distant, more ruler than husband. Yet amidst all speculation, the truth remained elusive, hidden behind the walls of the palace, and the silence Grace carried like a second skin. For Grace was not one to confide openly, not one to reveal her inner struggles to the world. She had mastered, from childhood, the art of composure. When hurt, she grew more poised. When lonely, she smiled with serenity. Her silence was both shield and prison, protecting her from intrusion but also deepening her isolation. It was this silence that sustained the fairy tale in the eyes of the world, even as shadows grew within it. Her children, sensitive to the moods of their parents, carried their own burdens. Caroline, growing into adolescence, became increasingly independent, often clashing with the structures around her. Albert, the heir, absorbed the solemnity of expectation, while Stephanie, youngest and most spirited, seemed to sense most keenly the unspoken tensions. Grace, in her maternal devotion, sought to shield them, to give them laughter and affection. Yet children, as they grow, always perceive what is left unsaid. And so, a woman once celebrated as the epitome of elegance became the subject of speculation about secrecy and strain. Did she find brief moments of freedom in those whispered friendships? Did she recall, in stolen conversations or hidden glances, the independence she had surrendered when she stepped from Hollywood into the palace? Or were the rumors merely projections, the world's attempt to reconcile the image of perfection with the inevitability of human longing? The paradox of Grace Kelly deepened in these years. To the world, she was flawless, a princess whose poise never faltered. To those who looked closer, she was a woman carrying both duty and desire, sacrifice and solitude. The image and the reality, once aligned, began to drift apart, creating a tension that would define her legend. For legends are not born of perfection alone, but of the cracks where light and shadow meet. The palace, with its walls thick and impenetrable, contained these contradictions, but the whispers still slipped through, carried by the press, carried by rumor, carried by the imagination of millions who could not believe that a fairy tale could remain untouched. And in the twilight hours, when the palace grew quiet and the sea whispered against the cliffs, Grace herself may have stood at the window listening to that eternal rhythm, wondering if the life she had chosen, or that had chosen her, was truly hers at all. The sound of the sea, patient and unending, washed against the silence, and it is with that sound that we move forward into the years when Rainier's burdens as ruler grew heavier, and Grace, in her quiet way, sought to bring art and culture into the principality, using beauty as her answer to power's severity. The steady rhythm of the sea pressed against the cliffs of Monaco, an eternal reminder that even the smallest of realms is held within forces larger than itself. Rainier, through prince and ruler, bore this truth daily. His principality was small, scarcely more than a city, yet it was sovereign, and its survival depended upon his vigilance. In those years, his duties weighed heavily upon him. He guarded Monaco's independence against the ambitions of larger neighbors, secured its economy through delicate negotiations, and maintained its dignity in the eyes of the world. He was, above all, a ruler, and in that role he often seemed stern, unyielding, even distant. Grace, beside him, watched and listened. Her own life was bound by rituals, yet she perceived in her husband's burdens the same tension that ran through her own, the collision between image and reality, between the facade presented to the world and the private doubts that lay beneath. While Rainier fought for Monaco's survival through politics and policy, Grace sought to fight for its soul through beauty, art, and culture. If the prince embodied the weight of authority, the princess sought to embody the light of inspiration. She began to champion cultural initiatives, drawing upon her connections in the world of cinema, theater, and literature. She invited artists to Monaco, organized festivals, and encouraged performances that would bring vitality to the small state. In doing so, she offered her adopted country more than elegance. She gave it visibility, relevance, and a place within the broader currents of cultural life. Her presence attracted attention, and attention brought visitors, commerce, and prestige. Yet behind her efforts lay a personal longing, the desire to remain connected to the world she had left behind, to keep alive the flame of creativity that still flickered within her. The palace, once austere, began to host concerts, exhibitions, and gatherings. The air, once heavy with ceremony, grew lighter with the sound of music, the movement of dancers, the words of poets. Grace, walking among these guests, smiled with the same composure she always carried, yet in her eyes there was often a glimmer of warmth, a trace of the actress who had once lived for the stage. It was as if she were reclaiming in fragments the self she had been before the crown. Rainier, though supportive, did not always share her enthusiasm. His focus remained on governance, on the solidity of law and economy. To him, art was adornment, valuable yet secondary. To Grace, art was sustenance, the means by which the soul is nourished. Their differing perspectives, though not hostile, created a distance between them, a divergence of priorities. Yet Grace continued her efforts, quiet but determined, believing that even in the smallest of states, culture could flourish and give meaning. In her private hours, she read voraciously, returning to the poetry she had loved since childhood. She wrote letters, notes, and reflections, some of which hinted at her inner struggles. She missed the craft of acting, the discipline of performance, the chance to inhabit roles beyond her own. But she also believed that life itself could be shaped as a performance, and so she played her part with unwavering dignity. Her stage was now Monaco, her audience the world, and her performance one of poise amid constraint. The people, for their part, admired her deeply. To them, she was more than a consort. She was the embodiment of Monaco's grace, the reason their tiny principality shone in the imagination of millions. Tourists arrived in greater numbers, drawn by the allure of seeing the actress-turned-princess in person. Hotels filled, casinos flourished, and the state's prosperity grew. Grace's presence was not merely symbolic. It was practical, essential to Monaco's survival in a world that might otherwise overlook it. Yet for Grace herself, the paradox remained. The very image that sustained Monaco was the image that confined her. She had become indispensable as a symbol, and in that indispensability, she lost the freedom to be simply herself. Did she ever stand before the mirror in her private chambers, gazing at her reflection, and ask whether the woman she saw was Grace Kelly or Princess Grace? Did she feel herself fading behind the veil of duty, even as she shone brighter in the eyes of the world? Her children grew, and with them her role as mother deepened. She guided them with love, but also with the awareness that they were heirs, bound by expectations beyond their choosing. Caroline's independence both worried and delighted her. Albert's destiny weighed on her maternal heart. Stephanie's restless energy foreshadowed storms to come. Grace, torn between protecting them and preparing them for duty, found herself caught once more in the tension between freedom and tradition. Rainier, meanwhile, continued his rule with determination. He respected his wife, admired her devotion, and relied on her presence. But his world was one of ledgers and treaties, while hers was one of imagination and feeling. Together, they embodied balance, the solidity of power and the delicacy of grace. Yet balance is fragile, and beneath it, currents of distance always threaten to pull them apart. Visitors to the palace often remarked on Grace's elegance, her ability to make every guest feel welcome, her serenity even in the most formal of settings. Few, however, glimpsed the solitude that lingered within her. In the quiet hours after receptions ended and corridors darkened, she returned to her books, her memories, her inner world. There she found refuge, though never escape. The sea whispered beyond the windows, steady and eternal, a reminder that life was larger than palaces, larger than crowns, larger than the roles we are forced to play. Her efforts to bring art to Monaco were not only for her people, but for herself. Each concert, each exhibition, each festival was a way of breathing life into a space that might otherwise have suffocated her spirit. Through culture, she found meaning. Through beauty, she found solace. Yet even this could not entirely fill the emptiness left by the art she had surrendered. The stage, the camera, the audience, these belonged to her past, and though she sought to recreate them in new forms, the loss remained. The sea outside the palace continued its endless rhythm, waves striking stone with patient persistence. Grace often listened to it, standing at the window, her gaze fixed upon the horizon. Did she imagine that somewhere beyond that horizon lay the freedom she had left behind? Or did she accept, with quiet resignation, that her life was now bound to the rhythms of duty, her identity forever entwined with a principality smaller than many towns, yet vast in its demands upon her? The sound of the sea deepened into the hush of evening when the palace grew still and Grace's thoughts turned inward. And from that hush, we move into another chapter, when Hollywood once again extended its hand, offering her a chance to return to the art she loved, only for Rainier's refusal to close the door forever. The hush of evening settled over the palace, the sea whispering against the cliffs as though urging her to remember the freedom she had once known. It was during such quiet hours that Grace allowed her thoughts to wander, and it was in these same years that the world she had left behind began, once more, to reach for her. Hollywood had not forgotten its princess. Directors still spoke her name with reverence, and among them none more fervently than Alfred Hitchcock, who believed she was the only actress capable of embodying the precise blend of mystery, poise, and vulnerability he craved for his films. Hitchcock, ever possessive of his creations, could not accept that Grace had abandoned cinema. To him, she was not merely an actress, but the archetype he had shaped, the cool blonde whose elegance concealed storms beneath the surface. In 1962, he extended an invitation for her to return, offering her the lead role in Marnie, a psychological drama that delved into the shadows of trauma and desire. The part was unlike any she had played before, complex, demanding, daring. For Grace, it represented not only the chance to act again, but the chance to prove that her artistry had not been extinguished by her crown. Her heart must have stirred at the offer, to step once more before the camera, to lose herself in a character, to inhabit a world beyond the rigid protocols of palace life. It was a temptation strong enough to awaken all she had surrendered. Perhaps she imagined the feel of the lights upon her face, the silent concentration of a crew, the intimate dance between actress and director. Perhaps she felt, for the first time in years, the spark of possibility, the promise of expression. Yet duty intervened. Rainier, cautious and protective of both his wife's dignity and Monaco's image, refused to allow her return. To him, the idea of his princess portraying a troubled woman in a Hollywood drama was unthinkable. It would diminish the solemnity of her position, invite scandal, and blur the boundary between princess and actress. He insisted that her role was now in Monaco, by his side, as consort and mother. And though Grace may have argued quietly, she yielded as she always had to the demands of duty. The door that had briefly opened closed again, this time forever. The refusal marked a turning point. Never again would she act in film. Never again would she step into the world that had once given her voice and meaning. Hitchcock, disappointed and perhaps resentful, went on to cast Tippi Hedren in the role, shaping another actress in the mold he had once reserved for Grace. The film achieved recognition, but in the hearts of many it was haunted by the ghost of the woman who might have played it. Marnie became not only a film, but a symbol of what Grace Kelly had lost. For Grace, the ache of that closed door lingered. She did not complain openly, nor did she rebel. Instead, she returned to her duties, her children, her cultural efforts. Yet beneath her composure there remained the quiet sorrow of one who has glimpsed freedom only to see it vanish. Friends who spoke with her in those years sensed her longing. She admitted in moments of candor that she missed her craft, that she still dreamed of acting, that she sometimes rehearsed lines privately as though to remind herself of the self she had once been. The paradox of her life deepened. The world adored her as princess, yet the world also remembered her as actress. She was admired for her sacrifice, yet pitied for it as well. In relinquishing her art, she had elevated herself to myth. But myths cannot breathe, cannot feel, cannot change. She had become eternal in the eyes of the world, but in her own eyes, perhaps, she remained unfinished, a role left incomplete. Rainier, for his part, believed he was protecting her, preserving her dignity and the integrity of Monaco. He did not see, or perhaps could not bear to acknowledge, the extent of her loss. Their marriage, though enduring, was tested by this tension, his insistence on duty, her longing for expression. Yet Grace, ever composed, concealed her grief behind smiles, carrying her silence as she always had. In the years that followed, she sought fulfillment in other ways. She devoted herself to philanthropy, supporting children's causes, hospitals, and charities. She nurtured her garden, finding solace in the quiet tending of flowers. She engaged in cultural diplomacy, meeting with artists and leaders, promoting Monaco as a place of beauty and refinement. These activities gave her purpose, yet none could fully replace the stage or the screen. For acting had been not only her profession, but her identity, the language through which she spoke her truest self. Without it, she remained in part unspoken. At times, she turned to writing. She composed poems, reflections, and even began projects that blended her love of art with her role as princess. These efforts offered fragments of expression, yet they were solitary, unseen by the world, unlike the collective experience of cinema. Perhaps she found comfort in them. Perhaps she found only reminder of what she had lost. Her children, growing into adolescence, became both her joy and her challenge. She devoted herself to guiding them, protecting them from the pressures she knew all too well. Yet their independence grew, their personalities clashed with expectations, and Grace often found herself caught between tradition and the desires of her offspring. In them, she saw both the weight of duty and the spark of rebellion, and she must have wondered which path they would ultimately follow. The palace, meanwhile, remained both sanctuary and prison. Its corridors, filled with echoes of history, still bore the silence she carried within her. Yet she endured, as she always had, transforming her sorrow into composure, her longing into dignity. The world continued to see her as flawless, unaware of the ache behind the smile, the dreams that remained unwritten. One wonders, when she stood at her window at dusk, watching the horizon where sea met sky, did she imagine herself on a film set once more, waiting for a director's call, waiting for the magic of a scene to unfold? Did she whisper lines from memory, rehearsing for an audience that no longer existed? Or did she simply close her eyes, allowing the rhythm of the waves to lull her into acceptance? The sea, patient and eternal, gave no answer. It continued its song as it always had, as it always would. And in that song, Grace found both comfort and sorrow, for it reminded her that life moves onward. Whether doors open or close, whether dreams are fulfilled or left behind, the ache of closed doors lingered in the air of the palace, and it is through that ache we now move forward into the later years of her life, when her public appearances grew quieter, her elegance matured into dignity, and her presence, though tinged with melancholy, remained a beacon to those who still saw in her the embodiment of grace. The ache of closed doors lingered in the palace air, yet time, with its steady hand, softened the sharpness into something quieter, something that seemed less like pain and more like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Grace, no longer the young bride of Monaco and no longer the luminous star of Hollywood, entered a new season of her life, one marked by maturity, by quieter appearances, by an elegance that had deepened into something solemn, almost contemplative. The world still looked to her with admiration, yet it was a different gaze now, not only for her beauty, but for the dignity with which she carried the weight of years. Her public appearances became fewer, yet when she did emerge, she remained a vision of poise. At galas, charity events, and state occasions, she glided into rooms with the same composure she had once brought to the screen, though the glimmer of melancholy was never far from her eyes. Admirers spoke of how her elegance seemed to have ripened, how she now exuded not only glamour but also wisdom, the aura of one who has endured sacrifice without surrendering grace. Her gowns were more subdued, her movements slower, yet her presence remained magnetic. The cameras still followed her, though their flashes now seemed gentler, less urgent, as though acknowledging that they were recording not a star ascending, but a legend enduring. Grace devoted much of her time to charitable work. She championed causes for children, supported hospitals, and gave her voice to humanitarian projects. These roles, though quieter than the triumphs of cinema, allowed her to embody a different kind of artistry, the art of compassion, of presence, of listening. In hospital wards and children's homes, she bent close to those she visited, her poise giving way to tenderness. Those who met her in such moments remembered not the distant princess, but the gentle woman who held their hand, who looked into their eyes as though nothing else existed. In these acts, perhaps, she found a measure of fulfillment that had eluded her in the rigid structures of court life. Still, the longing for her art never fully left her. In interviews, when asked about her career, she spoke with restraint, but her words often carried a subtle undercurrent of wistfulness. She admitted that she missed acting, missed the camaraderie of sets, the intensity of creation, the chance to step into lives beyond her own. Yet she quickly added that she was content, that her life as princess and mother gave her purpose. One wonders whether those words were spoken in truth or in resignation, whether her contentment was genuine or crafted, as carefully chosen as the lines of dialogue she once delivered on screen. Her relationship with Hollywood shifted in these years. She returned occasionally, not as actress but as guest of honor, as symbol of an age now past. At award ceremonies, festivals, and reunions, she was greeted with reverence, her presence reminding audiences of the golden years of cinema. She smiled, she accepted tributes, she spoke with grace. But she did not act again, and each appearance carried with it the bittersweet echo of what had been lost. Hitchcock himself, until his death, remained wistful about her departure, often hinting in interviews that she was the one who had slipped through his grasp, the actress who had become legend by absence rather than by continued performance. Within Monaco, Grace's maturity brought with it a certain stillness. She settled into routines, guiding her children through their turbulent adolescence, overseeing cultural projects, and tending her gardens. She found solace in small things: the fragrance of flowers, the play of light upon the sea, the rustle of leaves in palace courtyards. Friends spoke of how she loved to walk quietly among her plants, touching the petals, inhaling their scent, as though reconnecting with something simple and unadorned. In those moments, perhaps, she felt most herself, not princess, not actress, but simply Grace, the girl who had once wandered along the Jersey shore in silence. Yet even as her life grew quieter, shadows lingered. The strain of her marriage persisted, never erupting into scandal, but always present in the silences between her and Rainier. The demands of her children, particularly the spirited rebellion of Stephanie, tested her patience and her heart. And above all, the solitude remained. The solitude of a woman admired yet rarely known, adored yet often misunderstood. The image she projected was flawless, but the woman within it still carried the ache of unspoken dreams. Publicly, however, she never faltered. When she walked into a room, she was still the embodiment of grace. When she spoke, her voice still carried its clarity, its measured calm. When she smiled, the world still believed in the fairy tale. And perhaps that was her final performance, the role she played until the end, the role of princess, perfected not through scripts or direction, but through discipline, sacrifice, and an unyielding sense of duty. Her later years were not without joy. She found delight in her children's achievements, in their laughter, in the small triumphs of daily life. She enjoyed friendships with artists, writers, and confidants who respected her privacy. She traveled occasionally, her presence welcomed wherever she went, and yet, in every joy, there was a trace of melancholy, a reminder that she had once belonged to another world, a world of creativity and freedom that remained forever closed to her. The palace at night, illuminated by moonlight, seemed a mirror of her own life, beautiful, enduring, yet filled with shadows where silence lingered. Grace often stood by her window, gazing out at the Mediterranean, the same sea she had once driven beside in films, the same sea that had carried her from Hollywood to Monaco. Its endless rhythm was both comfort and sorrow, reminding her of what she had gained and what she had lost. Her dignity in these later years became her legacy. She was no longer simply the actress who had won an Academy Award, nor the young bride who had enchanted a prince. She was Princess Grace, matured into a figure of solemn beauty, admired for her endurance, her compassion, her ability to embody poise even when her heart carried longing. She became less a person and more a symbol, less a woman of flesh and blood, and more a presence that seemed timeless. And yet beneath the timeless image, there remained the fragile truth of humanity. The loneliness of closed doors, the ache of sacrifice, the quiet yearning for freedom. This tension between image and reality, between grace and sorrow, was what gave her life its haunting resonance. It was what made her not only admired, but unforgettable. The melancholy that traced her later years lingered like a soft note of music, fading, but never gone. And it is upon that note that we move forward into the final years of her life, when her children grew more restless, her heart more burdened, and the echoes of her own youth seemed to repeat themselves in the defiance of her daughter Stephanie. The soft note of melancholy lingered in the palace air, and in its echo came the sounds of children no longer young, no longer content to follow without question. Grace had entered the season of motherhood where joy mingles with worry, where the laughter of earlier years gives way to the storms of adolescence. Her children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie, were growing into themselves, and with that growth came defiance, longing, and the restless push against the weight of tradition. Grace, who had once rebelled in quieter ways against her own family's expectations, now found herself on the other side of the struggle, guiding, restraining, and fearing for children whose desires sometimes mirrored her own youthful yearning for freedom. Carolyn, the eldest, had always been spirited. Independent and strong-willed, she inherited her mother's elegance, but combined it with a determination that sometimes clashed with the rigid structures of the palace. Grace admired her intelligence, her energy, but worried about her insistence on charting her own course. Caroline's choices in love, her open disregard for convention, stirred unease within the principality and placed pressure upon her parents. Yet Grace, remembering her own restless youth, often found herself torn between admiration and apprehension, between pride in her daughter's strength and fear for the cost of her defiance. Albert, the only son and heir, bore a different weight. From an early age, he was groomed for duty, his education and demeanor shaped by the knowledge that one day he would rule. Grace watched him closely, anxious that the burden might smother his spirit. She guided him with gentleness, encouraging him to cultivate not only discipline, but also compassion, hoping he might become a ruler who combined his father's authority with his mother's sensitivity. Albert's quiet nature and steady presence reassured her at times, yet she also saw in him the loneliness of one born into expectation, and she must have wondered whether he too would carry the silent ache that had defined so much of her own life. And then there was Stephanie, the youngest, the child of storm and rebellion. From early on, she displayed a fiery independence, a resistance to rules, a restless energy that refused to be contained. Grace loved her deeply but struggled to guide her, for Stephanie pushed against boundaries with the same intensity that Grace herself had once concealed behind poise. She rejected the stiffness of palace life, defied expectations, and sought adventure and freedom beyond the safety of royal walls. Grace, watching her, felt both fear and recognition. She saw in her daughter the very defiance she had once suppressed, the spirit that had long whispered in her own heart, but which she had always hidden beneath elegance and silence. The mother and daughter clashed, as mothers and daughters often do. Grace urged restraint. Stephanie demanded freedom. Grace counseled patience. Stephanie sought immediacy. Their conflicts filled the palace with tension, not of scandal, but of intimacy, the painful intimacy of two souls, two alike, reflecting each other across a gulf of generations. Grace, disciplined and composed, saw in Stephanie the unrefined fire of what she herself had sacrificed. Perhaps she longed to protect her daughter from the pain of surrender, or perhaps she envied the courage with which Stephanie resisted. The press, ever hungry, seized upon these tensions. Whispers of rebellion, rumors of affairs, photographs of youthful indiscretions, all were magnified and cast upon the family as though they were betrayals of the fairy tale. Grace, always protective, tried to shield her children, tried to preserve their dignity, but the world was relentless. She knew too well how image could overwhelm reality, how the gaze of millions could distort truth into fiction. Now, she saw her children caught in the same trap, their lives interpreted, judged, and consumed. In her private hours, Grace confided her fears to close friends. She worried about her daughter's futures, about the strains of growing up in a palace where freedom was scarce and expectation suffocating. She worried about Albert, bound to a destiny that would never allow him escape. She worried about herself, about whether she had given them enough love to balance the weight of their heritage. These were not the concerns of a princess, but of a mother. And in those moments, Grace was once more simply Grace, vulnerable, uncertain, and deeply human. Yet even amid these struggles, she never abandoned her poise. In public, she remained serene, appearing with her children at ceremonies and celebrations, smiling with calm dignity, concealing beneath her composure the storms that brewed within her family. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the fairy tale must be preserved for the world, even if it frayed within the walls of the palace. One wonders what she thought as she watched her daughters grow into young women. Did she see in them her own reflection, her own youthful dreams now given voice through their defiance? Did she envy their courage, or did she fear the consequences they would face in a world less forgiving of women who stepped beyond expectation? Perhaps she felt both at once, envy and fear, pride and sorrow, contradictions woven into the fabric of her motherhood. The palace, once filled with the innocence of children's laughter, now echoed with the sharper sounds of adolescence. Arguments, slammed doors, whispered secrets. Grace, walking its corridors, felt the change deeply. The role of mother, once defined by tenderness, was now defined by negotiation, by the delicate balance between protection and freedom. And in this balance, she often felt the weight of her own past pressing upon her. Still, there were moments of joy. Festivals, family dinners, quiet evenings in the garden brought glimpses of harmony. Grace cherished these, holding them close as reminders that love endured even amid struggle. She continued to nurture her children, to guide them, to protect them, even as she knew that she could not shield them from themselves. In Stephanie's rebellion, Grace may have seen the inevitability of her own story repeating, not in exact detail, but in spirit. The longing for freedom, the resistance to duty, the yearning for self, these were the currents that had shaped Grace's life, and now they flowed through her daughter as well. Perhaps she hoped that Stephanie might find a path she herself had not found, a way to reconcile freedom with duty, self with role, or perhaps she feared that rebellion would lead only to pain. The sea outside the palace continued its eternal rhythm, as if indifferent to the struggles within. Yet to Grace its sound must have seemed like a mirror of her own life, waves rising and falling, moments of calm giving way to storms, patterns repeating themselves endlessly. And as she stood at her window, gazing out upon that sea, she must have wondered whether the destiny she had accepted was also the destiny her children would inherit, whether the weight of crowns and names could ever be escaped. The storm of adolescence within the palace did not end, but rather deepened with time, and it is through this gathering storm that we move forward, into the day when Grace herself would drive along those same coastal roads she had once traveled in film, accompanied by her daughter Stephanie, and into the shadow of the tragedy that would end her life and turn her story from fairy tale into legend. The storm within the palace gathered quietly, carried in the restless footsteps of youth, and from that storm Grace moved toward the day when her own fate would meet her daughter's rebellion upon the winding coastal road. It was September of 1982, and the Mediterranean lay, as it always had, glittering under the sun by day and silvered by moonlight at night, its waves striking the rocks below Monaco with patient indifference. Yet even the most eternal rhythms cannot protect us from the suddenness of tragedy. Grace, now 52, carried herself with the same elegance as ever, though her face bore the subtle traces of time, lines softened rather than sharp, beauty matured into solemn dignity. She had endured the strains of duty, the whispers of rumor, the ache of relinquished art. Her children were nearly grown, each carrying their own struggles, their own defiance, their own burdens. Stephanie, at 17, was the most turbulent of all, her fiery spirit clashing with the palace's restraints. Mother and daughter quarreled often, as two mirrors reflecting different versions of the same soul. On the morning of September 13th, the princess prepared to drive from her summer residence, Rock Aigle, a villa high in the mountains, down toward Monaco. With her was Stephanie, unwilling to be left behind. The roads that wound through the cliffs were narrow, twisting, and unforgiving, bordered by sheer drops where stone met sea, far below. Grace had driven them before, perhaps recalling the scenes filmed decades earlier for To Catch a Thief, when she had steered a car along those very bends with Cary Grant by her side, unaware of how fate would one day transform cinematic play into mortal danger. Accounts differ on what precisely happened in those final moments. Some say she suffered a stroke at the wheel, her health weakened by years of hidden ailments. Others believe the car simply faltered, its brakes failing on the descent. What is certain is that the vehicle veered from the road, plunging into the brush, tumbling down the rocky slope. The sound of metal against stone shattered the morning stillness, and the car came to rest in ruin. Stephanie survived, though injured. Grace was pulled from the wreckage unconscious, her body broken, her life hanging in a fragile balance. She was rushed to the hospital in Monaco, where doctors worked with desperate devotion. For 36 hours, the world held its breath, clinging to the hope that the fairy tale might yet endure. News spread quickly. Televisions carried the reports. Radios spoke her name with hushed gravity. Newspapers prepared their front pages in sorrow. Crowds gathered outside the hospital, candles flickered in chapels, prayers were whispered across continents. Grace Kelly, once the shimmering star of Hollywood, now the Princess of Monaco, lay suspended between life and death. But fate, indifferent to prayer, carried her beyond. On September 14, 1982, she was pronounced dead. The announcement rippled through the world with the shock of something impossible made real. She was only 52, still radiant, still seemingly eternal. To many, she was not merely a princess, but a myth, a dream given flesh. Myths, it is believed, do not die. And yet she had. Rainier, stricken, carried his grief with the same stoicism he had carried his rule. The children, each in their own way, bore the wound of losing their mother so suddenly, so violently. For Stephanie, who had been with her in the car, the burden was especially heavy, a shadow that would follow her for years, shaping her own troubled journey. For Caroline and Albert, the loss was profound, leaving them motherless in a world that would never cease to watch them. The world mourned with them. Tributes poured in from Hollywood, from Europe, from ordinary people who had never met her yet, felt they had known her. For Grace had belonged to everyone, the star on the screen, the princess in the palace, the woman whose beauty had become a symbol of an age. Her death was more than the end of a life. It was the shattering of an illusion, the breaking of a dream. Fairy tales, it seemed, were not immune to tragedy. The irony was inescapable. She had once driven those same roads in a film, laughter on her lips, sunlight in her hair, the camera turning danger into charm. Decades later, the same roads became her undoing. Cinema had foreshadowed reality, as though the script of her life had been written long before she could read it. Was it chance? Was it fate? Was it merely the indifference of circumstance? The question remains, unanswered, echoing in the minds of all who remember. In the finality of her passing, Grace Kelly became something more than woman, more than actress, more than princess. She became legend, her life sealed into memory not as a whole, but as fragments. The girl from Philadelphia arranging her dolls in silent plays, the actress shimmering in Hitchcock's frames, the bride in lace walking down the cathedral aisle, the mother guiding her children, the woman driving along a road where destiny awaited. Each fragment shone with its own light, and together they formed a mosaic that no single truth could define. The sea, eternal and unyielding, continued its rhythm as her body was prepared for burial. The waves lapped against the cliffs as though nothing had changed, as though one more life had not been carried away. Yet for those who loved her, for those who admired her, the world was altered. The silence she had carried all her life had deepened into the silence of death, a silence that no voice, no applause, no prayer could ever break. And so, the fairy tale ended, not with eternal happiness, but with a car tumbling down a mountainside, with a princess lost too soon, with a legend born of tragedy. The road that claimed her life remained, winding and narrow, a reminder that beauty and sorrow often travel side by side, indistinguishable until the final moment. The morning bells of Monaco tolled, their sound carrying across the principality, through the palace corridors, across the sea. And from their solemn echo we move forward into the days of her funeral, when the world gathered to bid farewell, when millions wept for a woman who had seemed to belong to them all. The bells of Monaco tolled in mourning, their solemn voices rolling out across the harbor, echoing through narrow streets and carrying out to the sea as though to announce to the world that time itself had shifted. They rang not for ceremony, not for celebration, but for loss, for the passing of Princess Grace, once Grace Kelly, whose life had seemed made of light yet ended in silence. On September 18, 1982, the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, which had witnessed her wedding more than a quarter of a century earlier, opened its doors once again to receive her. But now she did not walk down the aisle in lace and silk. She was carried upon a bier, her body cloaked in dignity, her face hidden from the world that had adored it. The funeral drew mourners from across the globe. Royalty, statesmen, actors, and ordinary citizens came together, their presence turning the small principality into a place of collective grief. Queen Elizabeth II sent representatives. Nancy Reagan arrived on behalf of the United States. Cary Grant, who had once shared the screen with her, sat among the congregation with bowed head. Figures of cinema, of politics, of nobility, all gathered, their differences erased in the shared recognition that they had lost more than a princess. They had lost a symbol, a dream, a figure whose life had bridged continents, cultures, and centuries. Within the cathedral, the air was thick with incense and sorrow. Candles flickered against the stone, casting shadows upon the same walls that had glowed during her wedding. The choir's voices rose in solemn hymns, their notes heavy with grief. Rainier, stricken and aged by shock, sat alone, his face carved with despair. His children, fragile in their mourning, clung to the rituals as though they might steady them. Caroline, already marked by strength, held her sorrow with poise. Albert, burdened by the knowledge that his responsibilities would only deepen, bowed his head in silence. Stephanie, still injured from the accident, sat broken both in body and spirit, her young face a mirror of unbearable guilt. The world watched. More than 100 million people followed the broadcast, their televisions carrying images of a coffin draped in Monaco's flag, of crowds lining the streets, of flowers laid in abundance. The fairy tale that had begun with fanfare and celebration ended with weeping, and yet even in mourning, the story did not lose its enchantment. For grief, too, can shape legend, and in death, Grace Kelly became not only remembered, but sanctified, her image preserved forever in the golden light of memory. The paradox was striking. In life, she had often struggled to reconcile image with reality, to balance the poise demanded of her with the longing hidden beneath. In death, those contradictions dissolved into myth. No longer could she falter, no longer could she be misunderstood. She was eternal now, forever fixed in the minds of those who loved her as the embodiment of elegance, beauty, and tragic sacrifice. The woman who had once feared being imprisoned by her image was now immortalized by it. Eulogies spoke of her compassion, her dignity, her devotion as mother and princess. Few spoke of the sacrifices she had made, of the ache of roles she had abandoned, of the loneliness that had followed her like a shadow. Perhaps it was kinder that way, for funerals are not meant for contradictions, but for consolation. And yet one wonders whether Grace herself, had she been able to listen, would have felt comforted by such words, or haunted by the knowledge that even in death, her true self remained hidden behind the veil of legend. The burial took place in the Grimaldi family vault within the cathedral, beside the rulers who had come before her. The stone, the solemnity, the permanence, all spoke of tradition. Yet Grace, whose life had been lived between two worlds, seemed always more than tradition could contain. The thought of her resting beneath stone, her laughter silenced, her eyes forever closed, seemed almost unbearable to those who remembered her as light, as movement, as presence. Outside the cathedral, the people wept. Women clutched handkerchiefs, men bowed their heads, children asked questions their parents could not answer. Some remembered her films, others remembered her wedding, still others remembered small gestures of kindness she had offered during visits and charities. For each, she meant something different, yet for all, she meant something larger than life. Her story, once lived in fragments, now became whole in their collective sorrow. And so, the fairy tale ended not with a crown, but with a coffin, not with happily ever after, but with the tolling of bells. Yet perhaps this was always the way it must end, for fairy tales, when lived in flesh and blood, are fragile things, too delicate to withstand the weight of reality. Grace Kelly had seemed to have everything: beauty, fame, love, crown, yet she had paid the price for it all, a price written not in scandal or downfall, but in solitude and tragedy. Still, within the sorrow, there remained something luminous, for even in her passing, she gave the world a final gift, the reminder that beauty, though fleeting, leaves an echo, that sacrifice, though painful, creates meaning, and that legend, though born of loss, can endure longer than life itself. The fairy tale did not vanish with her death. It became eternal, woven into memory, retold across generations, carried forward in whispers, in photographs, in the lingering glow of her films. The bells of morning faded into silence, their last notes trembling in the air before dissolving into the endless rhythm of the sea. And it is with that silence that we pass into the final chapter, when her story, already complete in life and death, continued to unfold in legend, as books, films, and memories reshaped her into a figure who belonged no longer only to Monaco or Hollywood, but to the timeless imagination of the world. The bells of morning faded into silence, leaving only the slow breath of the sea and the memory of a woman who had once seemed made of light. Yet silence does not erase. It transforms. In the years after Grace Kelly's passing, her story did not end but unfolded into something larger, something less bound by the details of her life and more woven into the fabric of legend. She was no longer simply the girl from Philadelphia, the actress of Hitchcock's cool frames, or the princess walking palace corridors. She became all of these at once, and more. A figure who lived on in memory as though she had never truly left. Books began to appear, written by those who had known her, by those who had studied her, and by those who had merely glimpsed her across a crowded room. Each account sought to capture her, to define her, to explain the paradox of her existence. Was she a woman of sorrow or of fulfillment? A princess who found meaning in duty or one who was crushed by it? A star who surrendered her art, or one who discovered a deeper role in motherhood and charity? The books did not agree, for no single truth could contain her, yet in their contradictions lay her power. For Grace, Kelly had always been more than one thing, more than image, more than role, more than life itself. Films and documentaries followed, each layering her memory with new interpretations. Directors lingered on the glamour of her Hollywood years, replaying the luminous scenes of Rear Window or To Catch a Thief, reminding audiences of the radiance that first captured the world's attention. Others emphasized the majesty of her royal life, the wedding that had enthralled millions, the charity work that had touched lives in quiet ways. Still others focused on the tragedy of her death, the cruel irony of a car crash on the very roads that had once defined her cinematic beauty. And so her story was told and retold, each time reshaped, each time renewed. The people of Monaco remembered her with devotion. The hospital she had supported bore her name. Charities she had founded continued their work. Festivals she had inspired carried on in her honor. Her presence lingered in the principality, not as absence, but as aura, felt in the gardens she had tended, the halls she had walked, the cathedral where she rested. Tourists came from across the world to stand before her grave, to leave flowers, to whisper prayers, as though seeking connection not only with a princess, but with the dream she embodied. Her children carried her legacy in different ways. Caroline, strong and independent, bore much of the ceremonial burden, embodying the grace her mother had taught her. Albert, as prince, stepped into the role his father had carried, ruling with a steadiness shaped in part by his mother's compassion. Stephanie, marked by the trauma of the accident, struggled with rebellion and sorrow, her life unfolding in storms that seemed to echo the turbulence Grace herself had long concealed. In each child, fragments of their mother lived on, yet none could ever fully capture her. She belonged to them, but she also belonged to the world. For the world had claimed her, not as woman, but as icon. Her face, preserved in photographs and films, remained unchanging, forever young, forever poised. Fashion houses evoked her style. Designers spoke of her elegance. Actors cited her as muse. The name Grace itself became a symbol, evoking both beauty and dignity, both distance and longing. She was spoken of as saintly, though her life had been human, as flawless, though she had carried sorrow, as eternal, though she had died too soon. In this transformation lay the paradox of all legends. They are remembered not for what they were, but for what they mean. And what did Grace Kelly mean? To some, she was proof that fairy tales could be lived, that a girl from America could marry a prince and become a princess. To others, she was proof that fairy tales demand sacrifice, that beauty and privilege do not protect from loneliness or tragedy. To artists, she was muse. To rulers, she was symbol. To mothers, she was example. To daughters, she was warning. She was not one story, but many, and it is this multiplicity that keeps her alive. In quiet moments when her films are played once more in darkened theaters, her presence returns with startling clarity. The tilt of her head, the precision of her voice, the luminous poise of her movement, all remain intact, untouched by time. Audiences lean forward just as they did decades ago, compelled by the mystery of a woman who seemed to reveal and conceal at once. In those moments, she is no longer memory but presence, alive again in light and sound, her legend renewed with every viewing. Yet beyond the glamour, beyond the legend, beyond the endless retellings, there remains the simple truth of a woman who lived, who dreamed, who longed, who sacrificed, a woman who stood between expectation and freedom, between image and self, between the world that adored her and the inner silence she carried. Grace Kelly's story endures not because it was flawless, but because it was fragile, because within the beauty lay sorrow, within the triumph lay sacrifice, within the fairy tale lay tragedy. It is this fragility that makes her timeless, that makes her human, that makes her legend endure. And so the silence that followed her death became not an ending, but a transformation. From that silence rose a voice that still speaks, not in words but in memory, not in presence but in imagination. The bells of Monaco tolled, the waves struck stone, the world wept. But even as they wept, they began to tell her story, and in that telling she lived again. The sea continues its rhythm, eternal and unyielding. The palace still stands, its corridors echoing with history. The films remain flickering with light. The legend endures, whispered from one generation to the next, each retelling shaping her anew. Grace Kelly, the actress, the princess, the mother, the myth. She remains suspended between worlds, forever luminous, forever distant, forever remembered. And perhaps that is the final truth of her life, that she was never entirely one thing or another, never fully actress, never fully princess, never fully free, yet never fully bound. She was, above all, grace. Grace in name, grace in bearing, grace in the fragile balance between beauty and sorrow. And in that balance, she became timeless,